Eleanor Whitmore placed her small child down on the dirt floor of a strange kitchen, slowly straightened her back, and looked directly into the eyes of the man blocking the doorway. She weighed more than 300 pounds. Her clothes were patched and worn. She had only 9 cents left in her pocket, and behind her stood her 3 children, silent as shadows, watching everything. The man Hank, the ranch manager, looked her up and down. Slowly, without even trying to hide his judgment. "You're sure you came to the right place?" he said. Eleanor did not step back. She did not apologize. She did not explain who she was. She simply said one thing: "Where's the stove? I start tonight." It was the summer of 1884, deep in Montana territory, at Silver Creek Ranch. 20 men on that ranch had gone without a proper hot meal for nearly a month. The old cook had walked away without warning. The kitchen was falling apart. Supplies were running low, and no one, not a single person, had bothered to fix what was broken. They had grown used to watching everything slowly fall apart. Then Eleanor Whitmore arrived, a plus-size widow with 3 children and almost nothing to her name. A woman who had already been turned away by 4 different places before reaching Silver Creek. A woman the entire town would later whisper about, point at, and speak loudly enough that her 8-year-old daughter could hear every cruel word. But that night Eleanor lit the stove, and everything began to change in a way none of those 20 men could have imagined. Because Eleanor Whitmore did not come there just to cook. She came to uncover something rotting inside that ranch, something deeper than a broken stove, more dangerous than hunger, and something that had taken far more from those people than they realized. And when she discovered the truth, she did not run. She stayed, and she fought. If you are watching this story, I want you to know something. This story is for the women who were once overlooked, not truly seen. For the women who carried more than their share without anyone asking. For the women who woke up every morning, faced another impossible day, and still found the strength to begin again. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any chapter of Eleanor's journey. Turn on notifications and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, your city or state. I want to know how far Eleanor's story has traveled. Because Eleanor walked 9 miles through the July heat with only 9 cents in her pocket to reach Silver Creek Ranch. And her story deserves to be heard until the very end. The kitchen at Silver Creek Ranch had the particular smell of a room that had been abandoned in a hurry and then quietly given up on. There was grease baked onto the surface of the stove, going back what looked like years, sitting underneath the newer layer of ash and burnt food from whoever had been trying to cook in the weeks since the last cook left. The long wooden table in the center of the room had dishes stacked on it that hadn't been washed. There were dried food scraps on the floor that had attracted something small and fast, and Eleanor could hear it moving in the shadows near the wall when she stepped inside. She stood in the center of the kitchen and turned slowly, taking it all in. Hank was watching her from the doorway. He had his arms crossed. His expression was the expression of a man waiting to be proven right about something. "Well," he said. "How many men on the ranch?" Eleanor asked. 18 hands, plus Nathan. 20 men. "And how have they been eating?" Hank's jaw tightened slightly. "Cold meat, bread when we have it, coffee. For 4 weeks?" "For 4 weeks." Eleanor set the sleeping child down carefully on the cleanest section of the floor, which was a corner near the back wall, and she straightened up and looked at Hank. "What's left in the larder?" He hesitated. That hesitation told her more than his words would have. "Not much. Take me there," she said. She followed him to the storage room off the back of the kitchen. He opened the door. She stepped inside and stood very still for a moment, looking at the shelves. There were sacks of flour, 1 full, 2 that were down to the last quarter. There dried beans, a good amount of them. Cornmeal. Crock of lard. Salt. Some dried herbs in jars that she lifted one by one and opened and smelled. There were onions, soft but not gone. Potatoes with eyes sprouting from them in every direction, which meant they were old but still edible. A side of salt pork hanging from a hook. 3 jars of preserved peaches that someone had put up, she guessed, at least a year ago. Is there a garden? She asked. Hank stared at her. A what? A kitchen garden. Herbs. There was one, he said. Nobody's tended it, but it's still there? He thought about it. Far as I know. All right. Eleanor came back out of the storage room and stood in the center of the kitchen again. She looked at her children. Thomas, her 11-year-old, had come in from the doorway and was standing very straight against the wall, watching everything with eyes that were too serious for a boy his age. Grace, who was 8, had gone to the sleeping baby Samuel, who had just turned 5 and sat down beside him on the floor and was holding his hand. Eleanor looked at her children and something moved through her face, something private and fierce, and then she looked back at Hank. I'll need firewood, she said. A full load, not a half load. I'll need 2 buckets of water from the well. I'll need someone to take me out to that garden in the next 10 minutes so I can see what's growing. And I'll need the men to be at the table at 6 o'clock this evening. Hank uncrossed his arms. He was looking at her differently now. Not with warmth, not yet, but that shifted into something that was closer to attention. You're serious, he said. I didn't walk 9 miles with 3 children in July heat to be anything else, Eleanor said. Hank looked past her at Nathan, who had followed them in and was standing in the doorway. Nathan gave the smallest nod. Thomas, Eleanor said without turning around. Yes, ma'am, her son said immediately. When the firewood comes, you'll stack it. Not throw it, stack it. I'll show you where. Yes, ma'am. Grace, Mama? When Samuel wakes up, take him outside. Keep him out of the kitchen while I work. If any of the men speak to you, you be polite. You be respectful. You do not go anywhere with anyone. You stay where I can see you or where you can see this building. Understood, Mama? Eleanor took off her outer jacket. Underneath it, she was wearing a plain work dress, heavy cotton, the kind designed for labor. She hung the jacket on a nail by the door and turned to look at the ruined kitchen with the expression of a woman who has made a decision. 6 o'clock, she said to Hank. Tell the men. What Eleanor produced for 20 men by 6 o'clock that evening, working with ingredients that had been sitting neglected in a larder for a month, would be discussed at Silver Creek Ranch for a long time after. It was not fancy food. There was no pretension to it, no performance. There was a large pot of bean soup made from the dried beans she'd soaked in cold water all afternoon, flavored with the salt pork and the onions and the garlic she'd found, growing wild at the edge of the outlet to guard and named that she'd cut and bundled and hung near the stove to dry. There was cornbread, baked in the one good cast iron skillet she'd found at the back of a shelf, golden-crusted heavy reel. There were the potatoes she'd diced and fried in lard with more onion until they were browned on all sides and soft in the middle. There was fresh coffee, strong, made properly, which sounds like a small thing, but to men who had been drinking badly boiled bitter coffee for 4 weeks, it was not a small thing at all. She had Thomas carry the pot to the table. She had Grace bring the cornbread. She set it herself plates that she had washed, each one, the dried food soaked loose and the rims rubbed clean, stacked and carried out to the long table in the room off the kitchen where the men ate. The men came in, like men who had been living on disappointment come in slowly, with their hats in their hands, expecting nothing. They looked at the table. They looked at each other. They sat down. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a man named Vern, who was the oldest hand on the ranch and had the face of someone who had been outdoors for every day of his 50-some years, picked up his spoon and tasted the soup. He set the spoon down. He looked at it. He picked it up and tasted it again. Lord Almighty, Vern said quietly. That was all. But the way he said it was the way a man says something when he has been given something back that he didn't realize had been taken from him. The other men ate. They ate with the focused silence of people who are truly hungry. And as they ate, something in the room changed. It was not dramatic, it happened slowly, the way warmth comes back into a room after a window has been shut against the cold. Someone passed the cornbread without being asked. Someone refilled his coffee and then looked around the table and refilled the man next to him without thinking. Someone said, "This is good." And someone else said yeah, and someone else said nothing but ate 3 pieces of cornbread. Nathan sat at the end of the table. He had been running Silver Creek Ranch for 4 years, since his father died and left it to him, and he had spent those 4 years learning what it felt like to be responsible for something that was slowly slipping away from you. The cattle prices had dropped. The drought 2 summers ago had hurt the grass and the wells. There had been 2 bad winters. He owed more money than he liked to think about to a man in Billings named Walter Briggs, who was the kind of banker that other bankers looked at and felt better about themselves. Nathan had not been a happy man in a long time. He sat at the end of his table on a Tuesday evening in July and ate bean soup and cornbread that a woman he'd met 3 hours ago had made from the leftover scraps in a neglected kitchen, and he did not say anything either. But he looked at the table. He looked at his men. He looked at the steam rising from the bowls and the way the lamplight caught it. And something in him that had been very quiet for a very long time woke up a little. Eleanor did not sleep well that first night. The room Nathan had given her and the children was small and plainly furnished, but it was more than they'd had in months. And for that reason alone she lay awake staring at the ceiling, long after Thomas and Grace and Samuel had gone still and soft in the way children sleep when they finally feel safe enough to stop holding themselves together. She had spent the last 8 months, since James died, learning what it meant to have nothing. She had always known, in the abstract way that people who are doing all right know things, that the world did not treat everyone equally. She had known that a widow with children in debt and a farm that couldn't sustain itself was going to struggle. What she had not fully understood until she was living it was how complete the judgment was. How quickly people decided what you were worth based on what they could see. She was large. She had always been large. James had never once made her feel that it was a failing. He was the kind of man who looked at her and saw her, the whole of her, and she had taken that for granted the way you take for granted the things that have always been true. After he died, she discovered that not everyone looked at her the way James had. That many people, most people, looked at her and drew conclusions before she opened her mouth. That those conclusions were not kind. She had been turned away from 4 jobs in Billings before she saw the notice about Silver Creek Ranch. The first had been a boarding house that needed help in the kitchen. The woman who ran it had looked Eleanor up and down and said, very politely, that they'd already found someone. Eleanor had seen through the window as she walked away that the position remained posted on the door for another 2 weeks. The second had been a laundry. The man who owned it had not been polite. The third had been a hotel that needed someone to clean rooms. The manager had said he was looking for someone more presentable. The fourth had been a family looking for a housekeeper, and the wife had opened the door and looked at Eleanor, and then looked at the 3 children behind her and said, "We need someone who can move quickly," and closed the door. Eleanor had stood on the sidewalk outside that last house for a long moment. Samuel had looked up at her and said, "Mama, are we going home now?" And she had looked down at her youngest child and said, "Not yet, baby." And then she had found the notice for Silver Creek Ranch. And she had used the last of her coins to pay for 1 night in the cheapest room she could find, and she had spent that night making a decision. She was not going to apologize for existing. She was not going to make herself smaller to fit into spaces that had been decided were not for her. She was going to show up. She was going to work. And she was going to let that be enough. It hadn't felt like courage at the time. It had felt like the only thing left. Now, lying in the dark in a room at Silver Creek Ranch with her children sleeping around her, and the sound of a Montana night coming in through the thin walls, she was calculating. She was always calculating. It was one of the things James had loved about her, and that the rest of the world mostly didn't know she was doing, because she kept it quiet. She was calculating what she had, what she needed, what she could build, and how fast. The kitchen would take 3 days to get into proper working order. The garden was overgrown but salvageable. She'd seen tomatoes coming in, squash vines sprawling, what looked like beets under some of the weeds. The men were hungry in a way that went past the stomach. She'd seen it at dinner, the way some of them had looked startled by the food, The way Vern had said, "Lord Almighty," the way you say something like that when you've been given grace you didn't expect. Hungry men with no proper meals are men who have been told without words that they don't matter enough for anyone to take care of. She knew something about that. Nathan Caldwell was harder to read. He'd said almost nothing at dinner. He'd watched, which told her more than words would have. He wasn't cruel. She'd worked out that much in the first 3 hours. He was tired, and tired people sometimes mistake their exhaustion for coldness and let it run the same direction for too long. She didn't know yet what was underneath the tired. She was going to find out. And there was something else she'd sensed today, something at the edges of things that she didn't have enough information yet to name. The way Hank had hesitated when she asked about the larder. The way one of the younger hands, a boy of maybe 19 with a split lip that was fresh enough to still be swollen, had looked at Nathan with an expression that wasn't quite fear, but had fear in its family tree. The way someone had, when they thought she wasn't listening, said something in a low voice to the man next to him during dinner that included the words Billings and Briggs. She filed it away. She would find out. But tonight she had fed 20 men and her 3 children. Tonight she had made something out of nearly nothing and watched it matter. Tonight was enough. She turned onto her side, and Samuel, in his sleep, put one small hand on her arm. She lay still and let him hold on. In the morning she was up before 5. She had Thomas and Grace up by 5:30. Samuel slept another hour. He was still young enough that sleep was something he fell into completely, and she left Grace to watch him and took Thomas with her to the kitchen. "Did you see where they keep the axe?" she asked her son. "Out back," he said. He was still half asleep, his dark hair sticking up on one side, but he was upright and present, and Thomas had always been the kind of boy who once up was up. "The woodpile's getting low. Need to ask Ethan about getting more cord wood in, but until then I need you to split what's out there as small as you can manage. The stove runs better on smaller pieces." Thomas nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mama, are we staying?" Eleanor was working the pump at the sink, filling the large pot she'd need for the oats she was planning for breakfast. She didn't stop pumping. "That depends," she said. "On what?" "On whether we make ourselves worth keeping," she said. "So let's do that." Thomas nodded again, and something in his young face settled into a kind of resolve that was older than he was. He went out the back to find the axe. Eleanor had the oatmeal going, and the coffee started, and 4 dozen biscuits mixed and shaped and in the oven by the time the first of the hands stumbled into the kitchen doorway at 6:30, drawn presumably by the smell. Because nobody had told them there would be breakfast at all. The previous cook had only done supper. The man stopped in the doorway. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s named Curtis, who Eleanor had identified yesterday as one of the quieter ones, the kind of quiet that was either thoughtful or sullen, and she hadn't yet worked out which. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. "You're making breakfast?" "Every morning," Eleanor said. She handed him a mug of coffee. "Biscuits in about 10 minutes, tell the others." Curtis looked at the mug in his hand. He looked back at her. "We don't. We never had a morning cook." "You do now," she said, and turned back to the stove. Curtis went out to tell the others. By 7 o'clock, every hand on the ranch was sitting at the table for breakfast, and Eleanor heard Nathan's voice in the doorway before she saw him, saying something to Hank in a low tone that stopped mid-sentence when the smell hit him. She looked up. Nathan was standing in the kitchen doorway in a way that suggested he'd come by out of habit on his way to something else, and had been stopped by the biscuits. "I hope you don't mind," Eleanor said. "I did the math on what it cost to run a crew on cold meat and coffee, and it came up short." Nathan looked at the table full of his men eating biscuits and oatmeal, and not complaining about anything. He looked at Eleanor. There was something working in his face that she couldn't quite name. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked. "My mother," Eleanor said. "And practice. Sit down, Mr. Caldwell, your oatmeal's getting cold." She said it the way a woman says something when she's not actually asking. Nathan, to his credit, sat down. The second afternoon, she found the boy with the split lip sitting on the fence rail outside the corral, and when he heard her coming, he turned his face away from her, the way people do when they're hiding something. "I've got some yarrow salve," she said, stopping beside the fence without climbing it. "Helps with swelling." The boy, his name was Danny, she'd learned, and he was 18 and from Wyoming and had only been on the ranch 6 weeks, turned back to look at her sideways. "Ain't swelling," he muttered. "No," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "Not anymore. But it was 2 days ago. Was it one of the men here?" Danny's jaw tightened. "Fell," he said. Eleanor let the lie stand. She'd known it was a lie before she asked. The split was in exactly the wrong place for a fall, and the bruising was patterned the way bruising is patterned when something meant to hit you. "All right," she said. "Offer stands. Salve's in the kitchen." She started to walk away. Danny said, behind her, quiet enough that she almost missed it, "It was in town." She stopped. "She turned Briggsman," Danny said. "He was looking at the dirt. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." "Papers. In the bank. I wasn't snooping, they sent me in to wait in the back office, and the papers were right there on the desk. I didn't read them all, but I saw the numbers and Mr. Briggs came in while I was sitting there, and he knew I'd seen them, and his man Danny stopped. He touched his lip with 2 fingers, involuntary. Eleanor was very still. "What kind of papers?" she said. "Land papers," Danny said. "With Mr. Caldwell's name on them, and numbers they didn't look right to me. The numbers on what the ranch owes. They looked bigger than what Mr. Caldwell talks about, like someone had made them bigger." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me, Danny." "I didn't tell you nothing," Danny said quickly. "I never said nothing." "No," Eleanor said. "You didn't." She paused. "The salve's in the kitchen," she said again. "Any time." She walked back toward the house, and her mind was already moving, already sorting through what she knew and what she needed to find out. The way it always moved when she understood that there was a problem, and that the problem was hers to solve whether anyone had asked her to or not. On the 3rd day, she cleaned the entire kitchen. Not surface cleaned, not tidied. She took everything out of every cabinet and shelf and scrubbed the insides with lye soap and hot water. She had Thomas help her move the stove out from the wall and cleaned behind it, and found, in the process, a cast-iron Dutch oven that was so caked with old grease it had been unrecognizable as cookware, and that, after 2 hours of work with a scraper and a rag and more hot water, turned out to be the finest pot she had ever held in her hands. She found a set of knives in a wooden box on a high shelf that someone had put away properly and that were still sharp. She found seeds paper packets, dried, tucked behind a jar of salt that had labels written in a woman's handwriting: carrots, beans, squash. She looked at the handwriting for a long moment. Nathan's mother, she supposed, or someone else who had stood in this kitchen and tried to build something. She put the seeds in her apron pocket. On the 4th day, she asked Nathan if she could plant them. She found him in the barn, which was the place she had worked out that he went when he wanted to be somewhere that didn't require him to be responsible for anything for a few minutes. He was brushing his horse, a dark bay mare who had the calm, patient quality of a horse that has been with one person for a long time, and he didn't hear her come in, which meant she was able to watch him for a moment before he noticed her. He looked different in the barn, in the house, in the kitchen doorway, at the head of the table. He held himself with the careful erectness of a man who knows people are watching him. In the barn, alone with his horse, he let himself be tired. The tiredness was in his shoulders, in the way he moved without efficiency. He brushed the horse with a kind of repetitive attention that wasn't about the horse at all. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He turned without startling. He had heard her, after all, or he was hard enough to startle out of the practice of it. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "It is," she said. "Found seeds, your mother's, I think. Or someone's." He looked at the paper packets she held out. He looked at them for a moment. "My mother's," he said. Then, as though he hadn't meant to, she'd have been glad someone found them. "I'd like to plant them," Eleanor said. "The garden's got room. I'll tend it myself. It won't interfere with the cooking." Nathan looked at her. "You're already feeding 20 men 3 times a day," he said. "You've cleaned a kitchen that 4 of my hands said they were afraid to go into. You've got your children helping out more than some of my paid workers. And you want to also replant the garden. I want to make this place work," Eleanor said simply. "The garden will help with that. Why?" Nathan said. "Not unkind. You've got your room. You've got your pay. What's in it for you to go past that?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I came here with 3 children and 9 cents in my pocket," she said. "I knocked on 4 doors before yours. I was turned away at all 4, and not because I can't work. You and I both know why I was turned away." She paused. "I've stopped explaining myself to people who've already made up their mind about me. But I'll tell you this once, because I think you're actually asking. I do not know how to give less than everything I have to something that matters. This ranch matters. Your men have been walking around for a month like men who forgot they were worth feeding. That bothers me. It bothers me the same way a dying garden bothers me. Because both of them can be fixed if someone decides to do the work." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. The mare shifted under the brush, and he steadied her automatically, his hand flat against her neck. "Plant the seeds," he said. Eleanor nodded. She started to go. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nathan said. She stopped and turned back. He was looking at her with that expression she still hadn't fully named. It was something adjacent to recognition. The way a man looks when he's seen something he didn't expect to see. "I'm obliged to you," he said, "for what you've done this week." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're not obliged." "I'm being—" She paused. "But you're welcome." She went back to the kitchen, and in her apron pocket the seeds in their paper envelopes were warm from being carried against her body all afternoon. And she thought about a woman she had never met who had stood in this same kitchen and believed it was worth planting things in the ground. She thought she understood her. On the 6th day, Walter Briggs came to Silver Creek Ranch. He came in a buggy, which was not how working men came to a ranch. He was a man of about 50, with the kind of well-maintained appearance that meant he had the money to look like he wasn't worried about money. And he came with another man riding alongside the buggy on a horse. A large man with a flat expression who stayed at the edge of things, in the way that men stay at the edge of things when their job is to make other men feel watched. Eleanor was in the garden when they arrived. She heard the buggy before she saw it. And she went still among the weeds and watched through the fence rails as Briggs stepped down from the buggy and Nathan came out of the house to meet him, and the 2 men shook hands in the way of men who do not like each other, but have reason to be civil. "Caldwell," Briggs said. Nathan said, "You should have sent word." "Didn't want to give you time to prepare," Briggs said, and said it pleasantly. The way you say something that you want the other man to know is a threat, but that you can claim was a joke if you need to. "Thought I'd come see how things are progressing. Heard you found yourself a cook." "I did," Nathan said. "Heard she's quite the specimen," Briggs said. Eleanor did not move. She felt the words land the way those words were designed to land, like a hand on the back of your neck, designed to make you feel small, and she stayed still in the garden and let them pass through her, and out the other side. And she thought about the seeds she'd planted that morning, and the way the soil had felt between her fingers, and she kept her face still. "She's a fine cook," Nathan said, and his voice was careful. "She's a widow with 3 children living on your property," Briggs said. "You want to be careful about appearances, Caldwell. People in town are talking. People in town," Nathan said, "are welcome to come out here and cook for 20 men themselves if they've got opinions about it." Briggs smiled. The smile did not have warmth in it. "I'll get to the point," he said. "The note's due at the end of summer." "I want to know your plan." "My plan," Nathan said, "is to have it paid." "With what money?" "The herd's in good shape. The prices are coming back up." Briggs looked around the ranch slowly, the way a man looks at something he expects to own eventually and is taking inventory of. You've been saying the prices are coming back for 3 years, he said. I've been patient, Caldwell. I've been more than patient. But patience has a limit. He got back in his buggy. The large man on the horse watched Nathan with a flat expression. End of summer, Briggs said. I'll expect to hear from you. He looked for just a moment, toward the garden, toward where Eleanor was crouched among the weeds. His eyes settled on her with a total absence of respect that some men reserve for people they've already categorized as irrelevant. Eleanor met his gaze. She held it. Briggs looked away first. The buggy drove out through the gate, and Nathan stood very still in the yard for a long moment. And then he turned and walked back toward the house, and Eleanor stood up in the garden and brushed the dirt from her hands and thought about Danny's split lip and the numbers on the papers that didn't look right. She thought about the woman who had planted these seeds. She thought about the ranch hands who had come to breakfast that morning and argued cheerfully over the last of the biscuits. She thought about her children. She went back to the kitchen and she started supper, and she thought. Supper that night was quieter than usual. Eleanor noticed it the moment she brought the pot to the table, the way the men sat differently. The way their conversations dropped off when she set things down and then resumed in lower registers that told her they'd been talking about something they weren't ready to share with her yet. She'd learned the sounds of this ranch the way she'd learned the sounds of every place she'd lived, what the normal noise was, what a change in it meant. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and listened. Vern's voice, carrying without him knowing it, Briggs doesn't come out here personal unless he wants something. Curtis Lower, he wants the ranch, same as he's wanted it for 3 years. A third voice she hadn't learned yet, Caldwell ain't gonna sell. Vern Caldwell ain't gonna have a choice if the note comes due and the money ain't there. Silence after that. The kind of silence that settles over men when they've said the true thing out loud and now have to live with it sitting in the middle of the table. Eleanor turned back to the stove. She stirred the pot and thought about the ledger. She'd seen it 3 days ago, sitting open on the small desk in the room Nathan used as an office, when she'd gone looking for him to ask about the flour order. She hadn't read it, she'd had no right to read it, but she'd seen the shape of the numbers the way you see the shape of a situation, without reading every word. She'd seen the column of what was owed, and she'd seen the column of what was coming in, and she'd seen the gap between them. She thought about what Danny had said. Numbers that didn't look right. Numbers that looked bigger than what Mr. Caldwell talks about. She thought about Walter Briggs's eyes settling on her in the garden and moving away. She thought about the woman who had planted the seeds. She made a decision. Nathan was in his office after supper. She could see the light under the door. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment. In her left hand she was carrying a plate cornbread, left over from supper, and a cup of coffee, because she had found that in this world, if you arrived at a man's door with food, the first 30 seconds of any conversation went differently. She knocked with her right hand. "Come in," Nathan said. She opened the door. He was at the desk, the ledger open in front of him and his elbows on either side of it and his hands in his hair, which was the posture of a man doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. He looked up. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. "I didn't ask for," he started. "I know," Eleanor said. She set the plate on the corner of his desk. "I made extra." She did not leave. She stood across the desk from him with her hands folded in front of her, and she waited, and after a moment Nathan leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was past to pretending to be anything else. "What do you need, Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "To ask you something," she said. "And I need you to tell me the truth." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's so. How bad is it?" she said. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who didn't know the answer. It was the silence of a man deciding whether to give it. "Bad enough," he said finally. "The note with Briggs." "I told you he started. Danny told me Briggs' man hit him for seeing in the back office," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. "Papers with your name on them and numbers that didn't match what you've been told you owe. I'm not asking you to tell me things you don't want me to know. I'm asking you to tell me if someone has been changing those numbers." Nathan was very still. He looked at her for a long time. Something was moving in his face, not anger, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that was anger pointed inward, which is the worst kind. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've never been able to get Briggs to show me the original documents. He always has reasons, delays, changes to the meeting. His office burned 2 years ago, and he says the copies were lost in that." He paused. I've wondered for a year. But wondering and being able to prove are two different animals." "Yes," Eleanor said, "they are." She looked at him steadily. "Do you have any of your own records, payment receipts? Anything from when the loan was first made?" "Some," he said slowly. "My father handled most of it before he died. There's a box in the back. I've never been through all of it." "I'd like to," Eleanor said. Nathan stared at her. "You'd like to go through my father's financial records?" "I'd like to help you find out if someone is stealing from you," Eleanor said. "I'm good with numbers. My husband used to say I should have been a banker." She paused. He meant it as a compliment. Nathan looked at her for another long moment. He picked up the cornbread from the plate and took a bite. Not because he was hungry, Eleanor thought, but because he needed a moment to think. "Why?" he said. "It's not your problem. This ranch is where my children sleep," Eleanor said. "That makes it my problem." He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked back at her. "Boxes in the storeroom," he said. "Back corner under the canvas. I'll get it for you in the morning." Eleanor nodded. "Mrs. Whitmore," Nathan said. She turned back. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the barn, that expression she still hadn't fully named. "You're not what I expected," he said, "when you showed up that first day." "I know," Eleanor said. "People rarely are." She went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a long moment in the dark, and she let herself feel the weight of what she'd just agreed to do, and then she set it down and thought practically, which was the only useful thing to do with a large problem. The box arrived on her kitchen table the next morning, before she'd started breakfast, which meant Nathan had gone to the storeroom before dawn. He didn't say anything about it. He just set it down and poured himself coffee and stood with his back against the counter in the way that told her he was going to stay, and she didn't tell him to leave. Thomas looked at the box, looked at Nathan, and went to the woodpile without being asked. Grace took Samuel out to the garden. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire in the stove and the sound of Eleanor setting things up for the morning biscuits. She cooked breakfast. She did not open the box. The men came and ate and went back to work, and Nathan lingered but did not speak, and she let him linger. When the kitchen was cleared, she washed her hands and dried them, and sat down at the table and opened the box. Nathan sat down across from her. There were papers going back 20 years. Receipts, letters, contracts, folded and refolded, and some of them soft from age. There were 2 ledgers, older ones, his father's handwriting in the columns, neat and careful. There was a packet tied with twine that turned out to be the original loan documents, from when Gerald Caldwell had taken money from the Sip Savings and Lending Company, which was now Walter Briggs's bank, Eleanor noted, having been bought out 4 years ago when Nathan was already running the ranch. She began to read. She read carefully and slowly, the way she'd learned to read anything important. Not looking for conclusions, but looking for the thing that was slightly off, the number that was wrong by just enough to be deniable. Nathan watched her. He didn't interrupt. He refilled her coffee at some point without asking. She drank it and kept reading. An hour in, she found it. It was not dramatic. The most important discoveries rarely are. It was a single page, a modification agreement, the kind that gets signed when a loan changes terms, dated 14 months after the original loan, 4 months after Gerald Caldwell's death. The signature at the bottom was Nathan's. Eleanor read the date again and looked up. "Where were you in November of 1881? She asked. Nathan thought about it. November of that was the winter of the bad cattle losses. I was out on the East Range most of that month, trying to bring the herd in before the storm hit. Were you in Billings at any point that November? No, Nathan said. He said it without hesitation. I didn't get into Billings until February. We were snowed in from December on. Eleanor set the paper flat on the table between them and put her finger on the date and then slid it to the signature. Nathan leaned forward. He read it. He read it again. That's not my signature, he said. His voice was very quiet. I mean, it looks close. But the way I make the N, it's different. My father taught me to make the N a certain way, and that's not. He stopped. His face had gone through several things very quickly and had arrived at something that was not quite anger and not quite shock, and was instead the expression of a man who has just understood that something he thought was bad luck has actually been a crime, and those are different weights to carry. Forgery, Eleanor said, a good one, but not perfect. Nathan sat back in his chair. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed out slowly. He's been adding interest on a loan modification I never signed, Nathan said. For 3 years. At least 3 years, Eleanor said. I haven't finished reading. Nathan looked at her. You think there's more? I think a man who would do this once has done it before, Eleanor said. I think Danny's not the first person who saw something in that back office they weren't supposed to see. Nathan was quiet. Then he said, if I go to Billings with this, he'll say it's my signature. He's got lawyers. He's got the sheriff's ear. He's got half the town council in his pocket because he holds their mortgages too. He paused. Who's going to take the word of a struggling rancher against the biggest banker in Billings? Eleanor looked at him steadily. You'd be surprised, she said, what becomes possible when the right people see the same evidence at the same time. Nathan looked at her. There was something working behind his eyes. You've got a plan, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've got the beginning of one, Eleanor said. I need to keep reading first. She turned back to the papers. Nathan stayed at the table. Neither of them spoke, but the kitchen was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people working on the same problem, which is a different kind of quiet altogether. She finished with the papers by mid-afternoon. By then she had found 3 modification agreements she was near certain Nathan had never signed, totaling an additional $4,000 in false debt added to the original loan. She had also found, tucked at the very bottom of the box beneath a folded piece of canvas, a letter that Gerald Caldwell had written, but apparently never sent, addressed to a lawyer in Helena named Aldous Grant, describing his concerns about the terms of the loan and asking whether there was legal recourse. Gerald Caldwell had died 6 weeks after the date on the letter. Eleanor held the letter for a moment. She thought about a man who had seen something wrong and had started to do something about it and then run out of time. She thought about his son, sitting across from her, who had been carrying the weight of that wrong, without knowing what it was for 3 years. She set the letter down carefully. Your father knew, she said. Nathan looked at her. She pushed the letter across the table. He picked it up and read it and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who is managing something that is trying to undo him. He never sent it, Nathan said. No, Eleanor said. But he wrote it, which means there was something to send. She paused. The lawyer he was writing to, Aldous Grant in Helena. Do you know if he's still practicing? I know the name, Nathan said slowly. I think my father mentioned him once or twice. They were friendly, I think. Before. I want to write to him, Eleanor said. Not as you, he doesn't know me. I want to write as someone who has found evidence of a banking fraud and wants to know if a Helena lawyer would be interested in seeing it. Nathan stared at her. You want to contact a lawyer in Helena? I want to contact a lawyer who your father trusted, Eleanor said. With 3 modification agreements that carry a forged signature and 14 months of unauthorized interest charges on false debt. She looked at him calmly. That's not a struggling rancher's word against a banker's, Mr. Caldwell. That's a document dispute, and disputes have facts. Nathan looked at her for a long time. Outside the window, she could hear Thomas splitting wood with the focused rhythm he'd developed over the past week, the steady thunk that meant he was doing it right. She could hear Grace's voice somewhere near the garden, talking to Samuel about something, her little girl's tone patient and explaining, and Samuel's voice asking something back. "He'll find out," Nathan said, finally. "Briggs, if I contact a lawyer, he'll find out." "He's got people everywhere." "He will," Eleanor agreed. "Eventually. Which is why we have to be ready before he does." She paused. "How long until the note is due?" 8 weeks, Nathan said. "Then we have 8 weeks. She folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to need to borrow 3 sheets of your best paper," she said. "And your ink." Nathan looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up and went to get them. She wrote the letter that evening, after supper at the kitchen table while the children slept. She wrote it twice, the first time to get the facts right, the second time to get the words right, which was always harder. She'd learned to write the way she'd learned most things, by doing it until it stopped being hard and started being just work. James had taught her that precision in writing was a form of respect for the person reading and for the truth you were trying to convey. She told Aldous Grant, in plain and careful language, that she had in her possession original documentation of a Billings bank loan from 1879. 3 modification agreements she had strong reason to believe were forged, and a letter from the original loan holder expressing concern about the bank's practices before his death. She told him she was not a lawyer and did not pretend to legal expertise, but she understood what a forged signature looked like, and she understood what unauthorized debt accrual was. She told him she was asking whether he would be willing to review the documents confidentially, and she gave Nathan's ranch address. She did not sign it with her name. She signed it, on behalf of Silver Creek Ranch. She folded it and sealed it and left it on the counter. In the morning, she asked Vern if he was going into town. Vern, who was the most reliable of the hands and the one she'd identified in the first week as the one the others listened to, looked at the letter and looked at her. "I can take it to the post," he said. "Don't need to be told it's private, if that's what you're wondering." "I was wondering that," Eleanor said. "Figured," Vern said. He tucked the letter inside his jacket. He started for the door and then turned back. "What you did this week," he said. "The food in the kitchen," and he stopped. He was not a man who had easy access to words for the things he felt. She could see that. "The men are different." "I've noticed," Eleanor said. Vern nodded. He turned the brim of his hat in his hands once, which was the closest he had to a formal gesture. "Good of you," he said. "That's all." He went to town. The change in the ranch hands did not happen all at once. It happened the way most real changes happen, in small increments that are impossible to point to individually, but that add up to something you can see clearly when you step back. It happened in the morning when men who had spent a month dragging themselves to a cold breakfast arrived early and sat down and talked to each other over hot food with something approaching ease. It happened in the afternoon, when Curtis, without being asked, fixed the hinge on the smokehouse door that had been broken since before Eleanor arrived. And when Danny, with his healing lip and his careful eyes, started helping Thomas with the firewood and showed him a faster way to stack it that kept the smaller pieces from rolling. It happened in the evening, when the kitchen, which had been a dead room, became the room people gravitated toward. Not just for food, for the warmth of it, for the sense that someone was there. Eleanor didn't encourage it or discourage it. She let it be. She moved around them, and they moved around her, and it became natural, the way things become natural when they're allowed to. Nathan saw it. She could tell he saw it the way he paused sometimes in the kitchen doorway in the evenings. Not long enough that any of the men would notice, but long enough that she noticed. He would look at the room, at Vern and Curtis arguing cheerfully about something ranch-related, at Danny teaching Thomas a card trick she wasn't sure she approved of, at Grace sitting on the stool in the corner, doing her reading with Samuel asleep in her lap, and his face would do that thing, that expression she'd been working to name for 2 weeks now. She named it one evening when she was washing up and he was still in the doorway. It was recognition. The recognition of something he had lost, being present again, unexpectedly, in a place it hadn't been for a long time. She didn't say anything about it. She dried the pot. The letter from Aldous Grant arrived 16 days later. It was brief. It said, "I knew Gerald Caldwell, and I know what Walter Briggs has been doing in that county for 15 years. I will come to Silver Creek Ranch on the 22nd. Please have the documents ready." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went to find Nathan. He was in the corral, and she didn't call out to him. She just stood at the fence rail and waited. And he saw her, and something in the way she was standing made him come to her without being asked. She handed him the letter. He read it again. He looked up. "He's coming," Nathan said. "The 22nd," Eleanor said. "That's 11 days." Nathan looked at the letter. He looked at her. "Eleanor," he said the first time he'd used her given name without realizing he was doing it, "what if Briggs finds out before Grant gets here?" "He might," she said. "People talk. And if he comes back here before the 22nd, then we deal with that when it happens," she said. "Right now we concentrate on having everything ready for Grant. Every document, every receipt, every modification agreement, in order labeled, so that when he arrives he can understand it without us explaining every piece." She paused. "I'll organize it tonight." Nathan was still looking at her with that expression. "You're not afraid," he said. Eleanor thought about this honestly. "I'm afraid," she said. "I've been afraid since I walked through your gate 3 weeks ago. I was afraid before that." She looked at him levelly. "Fear's not the same as stopped." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the letter again and folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. "I'll tell Hank," he said. "We'll make sure someone's on watch." "Good," Eleanor said. She started back toward the kitchen. "Eleanor," Nathan said again. She stopped but didn't turn around this time, because she was fairly sure, from the way he'd said it, that whatever came next was going to be something she needed to stay still to receive. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding," he stopped. Started again. "When you got here I thought you'd last 3 days. Not because another stop." She heard him exhale. "The men I've got out here, they eat through cooks, like horses eat through grass. I've had 4 in the last 2 years. 2 left before the month was out. One tried to stay and couldn't handle it, and the last one just walked away." He paused. "I told myself it was the work, but it wasn't just the work. It was that nobody here believed anything was going to get better, and that comes off a place, that feeling. It gets into the walls, and when you believe nothing's going to get better, you stop doing the things that would make it better, and then it doesn't, and you were right, and that's." He stopped. Eleanor turned around. He was standing with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders carrying a weight that she could see clearly now, after 3 weeks of watching him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ground. "That's a very lonely way to live," Eleanor said quietly. He looked up. "Yeah," he said. She looked at him for a moment, this tired, careful man who had taken in a woman no one else would hire because there had been no one else to do the cooking, and who had been slowly, without quite knowing it was happening, letting himself be reminded that a ranch could feel like a home. "It doesn't have to be," she said. She said it simply, without performance. Then she went back to the kitchen, because there were biscuits to make for morning and documents to organize and 11 days to prepare for. And sentiment, in her experience, was expressed briefly and then followed by action. But she was aware, as she walked, of the 11 days ahead of her feeling less like a countdown and more like a preparation. Which was different, which was better. 3 days before Aldous Grant was due to arrive, Eleanor found Grace crying in the garden. Grace was not a crier at 8 years old, she had the composed, watchful quality of a child who had been through enough to understand that composure is a tool, and so Eleanor's chest tightened immediately, in the way it tightened whenever one of her children broke from their ordinary behavior, because it meant something real had happened. She sat down on the ground beside Grace, which was not the easiest thing for a woman of her size to do and which Grace noticed. Which was why Grace stopped crying and looked at her in the way children look when they're trying to decide whether to be worried about you or let you worry about them. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, settling in. "Talk to me." Grace wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "There were some women in town," she said. "When Thomas and I went with Vern for the flower." Eleanor waited. "They were talking," Grace said. "About us." About she stopped and looked at her hands. "One of them said you were making a fool of yourself. Living here. With a man who wasn't your husband." Eleanor stayed very still. "She said it loud enough that she wanted us to hear," Grace said. Thomas got real quiet. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, but on the way back he wouldn't talk, and I could tell he was. She stopped again. "He was angry," Eleanor said. "He was hurt," Grace said. "Thomas gets quiet when he's hurt. He thinks I don't know that." Eleanor looked at her daughter, this girl who was 8 and already reading people the way grown women learn to read them, with the precision of someone who'd had reason to pay attention. "What did you feel?" Eleanor asked. Grace thought about it. "Angry," she said, "and then embarrassed. And then angry that I felt embarrassed." She looked up. "'Cause it's not true, is it?" No, Eleanor said. "It's not. So why did I feel embarrassed?" Eleanor thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because when people say something about you loudly, in public, your body reacts before your mind can," she said. "Your body feels the heat of it, the shame of it, even when you know it's not true. That's not weakness, that's being human." She paused. "What you do with that feeling afterward, that's the part that matters." Grace looked at her for a moment. "What do you do with it?" she asked. Eleanor looked out at the garden, at the tomatoes coming in, the bean plants climbing their poles, the beets she'd thinned just yesterday, and the carrots pushing up in their rows, all of it grown from seeds she'd found in a dead woman's kitchen. "I plant things," she said. Grace looked at the garden. She looked at her mother, and something passed across her 8-year-old face that was both older than 8 and exactly 8 the moment a child sees a truth about a parent and absorbs it into themselves. "Okay," Grace said. Eleanor put her arm around her daughter, and they sat in the garden for a few minutes without talking, which was sometimes the most honest conversation two people could have. When Eleanor got up to go back to the kitchen, Grace stood up with her and said, "Mama, Thomas is at the fence by the east pasture. He's been there since we got back." Eleanor brushed the dirt from her skirts. "I know," she said. "Let him have the time. He'll come in when he's ready." Thomas came in at supper time. He washed his hands and sat down at the table without speaking and ate his supper, and when he was done he cleared his own plate, which he always did, and then he went and stood next to Eleanor at the stove. "Mama," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The women in town," he said. He was quiet again. "Then I wanted to say something to them. I know. I didn't, because I didn't know what to say that would have been right," he said. "I kept thinking of things after, in the wagon, but not when it was happening." "That's how it works," Eleanor said. "That's frustrating," Thomas said, with the particular dignified frustration of an 11-year-old boy who has been raised to use words like frustrating. "Yes," Eleanor said, "it is." She looked at her son. "You want to know what to say if it happens again." He looked at her. "Yeah, nothing," she said. "You look at the person clearly, so they know they've been seen, and you keep walking." She paused. "The look is enough. The look says you did not diminish me, and I do not need to explain myself to you." Thomas thought about this with the serious, methodical quality that characterized everything he did. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. He went to bed. Eleanor stood at the stove for a moment after he'd gone, and she thought about all the things she'd had to teach her children in the last 8 months that she'd never planned to teach them. And she felt the weight of that, the way she felt it most evenings, deeply. And then she set it down. Because the weight was real, but so was the kitchen and the stove and the bread she still needed to finish. The night before Aldous Grant was due to arrive, Eleanor sat up late with the documents spread across the kitchen table, reviewing the organization for the last time. She heard boots on the porch, before the knock a single knock, her door, which meant Nathan, because the men knew which door was hers and didn't use it after dark. "Come in," she said. Nathan opened the door. He was in his work clothes still, which meant he hadn't slept. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at her. "I went through the property records today," he said. "In the county files, what I could pull without going to Billings. Briggs has done this before." He set a piece of paper on the table notes in his own handwriting. "Henderson's place, the Rourke brothers, both taking in 81 and 82. Both had notes that went bad sudden, right around the time Briggs acquired the bank." He paused. "Rourke's youngest told me, when I ran into him in town last year, that his father always said the numbers hadn't added up. I thought he was just how people get, looking for someone to blame. But if it's a pattern, then Grant needs to know about Henderson and the Rourkes," Eleanor said. She was already reaching for a clean piece of paper. "Tell me what you have." Nathan sat down across from her. He talked, she wrote. They worked at the table for 2 hours, Nathan's voice and Eleanor's pen and the lamp between them. At some point he picked up one of her biscuits from the plate she'd set out earlier and ate it without noticing he was doing it. And Eleanor noticed, and said nothing, because some things were more useful observed than commented on. At the end of 2 hours, the documents were organized. The supplemental notes were written, and Nathan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He said, "I've been running this ranch for 4 years, and he stopped." Eleanor looked up. "I've never had anyone to think with," he said. He said it like a man who's discovered something he hadn't known was missing, which is a different and harder discovery than knowing something is gone. Eleanor looked at him. "You have now," she said. It was a simple thing to say. It was not a small thing. Nathan looked at her across the table, with the lamp between them and the Montana night, pressing in around the windows, and the documents that represented 4 years of damage and maybe also a way out of it stacked in a neat pile between them. "I do," he said quietly. Eleanor gathered the papers and stacked them one more time and bound them with pieces of twine she'd set aside for that purpose. And she told Nathan to get some sleep because Grant was coming in the morning, and tired men made poor impressions on Helena lawyers. Nathan stood up to go. He took his hat from the hook. At the door he paused, and he said, "Eleanor," and she said, "Good night, Nathan," before he could finish, because she knew how he'd finish it, and she wasn't ready for it to be said out loud, not yet. Not because it wasn't true, but because some things needed to stay in the approaching until the present caught up to them. He went. Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table, with her hands folded on top of the bound documents, and she listened to the night sounds of Silver Creek Ranch, the horses settling, the distant cattle, the wind in whatever trees were out there that she hadn't learned the shape of yet, and she thought about Aldous Grant arriving in the morning. She thought about Walter Briggs. She thought about Henderson's place, and the Rourke brothers and Gerald Caldwell's unsent letter, and a loan that had been quietly bled for 3 years. She thought about what was coming. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed, because tomorrow required her to be rested and clear-eyed and ready, and those were things she knew how to be. Aldous Grant arrived at Silver Creek Ranch at 9:30 in the morning, and he was not what Eleanor had expected. She had pictured, without quite realizing she was doing it, a Helena lawyer, the way you picture a Helena lawyer, formal, careful, the kind of man who measured his words the way a jeweler measures gold. What stepped down from the hired buggy was a man of about 65 with a completely white beard, a coat that had seen better decades, and the kind of eyes that had been looking at dishonest things for so long that they had developed a particular quality of stillness, not cold, but settled, the way deep water is settled, and just as hard to see the bottom of. He looked at the ranch. He looked at Nathan, who had come out to meet him. He looked at Eleanor, who was standing slightly behind Nathan, the way she'd positioned herself deliberately, because this was Nathan's property, and Nathan's fight, and she was not going to make it about her before she knew how Grant read situations. Grant looked at her for a beat longer than he looked at Nathan. Then he said, "You're the one who wrote the letter." It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, Eleanor said. Good letter, Grant said. Precise. No hysteria in it. I appreciate that in correspondence. He looked at Nathan. Your father was a good man, Caldwell. He wrote to me once a few weeks before he died. Letter arrived after he was gone. Nathan went very still. He actually, Grant said. I wrote back. Letter came back unopened. He looked at Nathan steadily. I've been waiting for 3 years for someone at Silver Creek to give me a reason to come out here. Nathan looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything, but something passed between them that did not need words. Come inside, Eleanor said to Grant. Coffee's hot. They sat in the kitchen, the three of them, with the bound documents between them on the table. Grant went through them methodically and in silence. He had a pair of reading glasses that he put on without ceremony, and he turned each page with the care of a man who understood that what he was looking at was fragile in multiple senses. Eleanor had made coffee and a plate of biscuits with honey, and she sat across from Grant with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched him read. And she let the silence run, because she had learned that people who know how to read documents know how to read silence too, and interrupting his process would tell him something about her that she didn't want him to know yet. Nathan sat beside her. He was very still in the way he was still when he was managing something internal. She was aware of him the way you become aware of someone when you've spent enough time in close work with them, not intrusively, not romantically, just with the particular clarity of proximity. Grant turned the last page. He set it down. He took off his reading glasses and looked at the modification agreements. These 3, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. You identified the signature discrepancy in the N. My husband taught me his signature the way some men teach their wives their handwriting, Eleanor said. He said, man's signature is a legal instrument, and his family should know it as well as he does. She paused. James was careful about things like that. I paid attention. Grant looked at her over the table. Whitmore, he said. James Whitmore? Something went very quiet inside Eleanor. Out of Jefferson County? Grant said. We were in Jefferson County for 3 years, she said. Before, yes. Grant was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents. He looked at Eleanor. I handled a land dispute in Jefferson County in 1879, he said slowly. James Whitmore was a witness in that case. Good witness. Clear head, he paused. I was sorry to hear he'd passed. Eleanor's throat tightened once hard, and then she let it loose. Thank you, she said. He was a good man. The kitchen was quiet. Nathan looked at Eleanor. She did not look back at him, but she felt him look, and she knew what the look was, the quiet acknowledgement of a wound that doesn't need to be remarked upon to be real. All right, Grant said, in the tone of a man shifting from a human moment back to a professional one, which was the right shift to make, and Eleanor respected him for making it cleanly. He set both hands flat on the table. Here's what I can tell you. These signatures are forgeries. I won't testify to that in court without a handwriting expert, but I know what I'm seeing. The modification agreements add up to, he glanced at his notes, $4,300 in unauthorized debt, at an interest rate that was not in the original loan agreement. He looked at Nathan. Caldwell, the note you think you owe, what number has Briggs given you? $8,400, Nathan said. Your original loan was $2,300, Grant said. With the legitimate interest accrued over 4 years, you should owe somewhere between $3,000 and $3,500. Depending on exact payment timing. He let that sit. Nathan looked at the table. He was working something out. So $5,000 that I don't actually owe, he said. Approximately, Grant said. And if the pattern you've identified with Henderson and the Rorkeys holds, if I can get access to those records, this becomes something considerably larger than one ranch. He'll have the records locked up, Nathan said. He's the banker. He controls what people can see. He controls what his customers can see, Grant said. He does not control what a territorial court order requires him to produce. He paused. The question is whether we can get a territorial judge to issue that order. And for that I need two things. He held up one finger. I need a signed affidavit from you, Caldwell, attesting to these modifications, when they appeared, and your whereabouts at the time of signing that would make your signature impossible. He held up a second finger. And I need someone who saw those papers in Briggs's back office. Nathan and Eleanor looked at each other. She made the decision in about 2 seconds. I'll get Danny, she said, and stood up and went the back door without waiting for either of them to respond. Danny was at the fence line, which was where he'd been most mornings since his return from Billings. Eleanor came around the corner of the barn, and he saw her, and his face went through its usual careful assessment before settling. The lawyer's here, Eleanor said. The one from Helena. He needs a witness who saw papers in Briggs's back office. Danny looked at her. He looked at the fence rail. He looked back at her. I told you I didn't tell you nothing, he said. You didn't, Eleanor said. I'm asking you to tell a Helena lawyer. Briggs has men in this county, Danny said. His voice was low and it had fear in it, which she respected him for not hiding entirely. He knows where I sleep. He won't, Eleanor said, when this is done. You don't know that. No, Eleanor said, I don't. I know that it might be hard, and it might be frightening, and I know you're 18 years old and you've already had one of his men put a hand on you for seeing something you weren't supposed to see. She looked at him directly. I'm not going to tell you it'll be easy. It won't. I'm asking you to do it anyway because you're the only one who can, and because what Briggs has done to this ranch and to Henderson's place and to the Rorkeys has been done to other people too, and somebody has to be first. Danny was quiet for a long time. He was looking at the ground. Then he looked up and he said, the papers said Henderson's Bluff and Rourke Creek on them too. The property names, I saw them clear. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Would you say that to a Helena lawyer? Danny's jaw was tight. His hands were gripping the fence rail. He was 18 years old, and he was scared, and he was thinking about whether he was the kind of person who did the hard thing or the kind who let someone else do it. Yeah, said finally. I'd say that. Eleanor put her hand on the fence rail beside his. Thank you, Danny, she said. She went back inside. Grant took Danny's statement in the kitchen, writing it out longhand in his careful lawyer's script. Danny sat across from him and spoke in a low, steady voice, and Eleanor stayed at the stove and did not hover. Nathan sat at the far end of the table, present but not pressing, letting the boy do what he'd said he'd do without the weight of Nathan's anxiety on top of it. Danny described the papers. He described the property names he'd seen. He described the numbers as best he remembered them. He described the man at the door and what that man's hands had done to his face on the way out. When he was done, Grant set down his pen and looked at the boy across the table with the clear, even regard of a man who has seen a lot of testimony in his time and knows what honest looks like. That's enough, Grant said. You did a brave thing just now. Danny looked at the table. Don't feel brave, he muttered. Never does, Grant said. He said it in a way that meant he'd been in rooms like this before, and he had not always been the one holding the pen. Danny went back outside. Nathan exhaled slowly. Grant looked at the documents and then at Nathan. I'll ride to the county seat today, he said. I have a contact there, a circuit judge named Fairfield, who owes me a professional courtesy, and who does not, to my knowledge, owe Walter Briggs money. I'll apply for an order requiring Briggs to produce all loan modification records for the past 5 years. He began packing the documents carefully into his satchel. This is going to move fast or not at all. Men like Briggs have friends in many places, but they also have enemies, and this kind of evidence tends to travel in ways its creators can't predict. How long? Nathan said. A week, Grant said. Maybe 10 days. I'll send word the moment I have the order. He stood up. He looked at Eleanor. In the tone of a man delivering a verdict that he's already made up his mind about. The organization of those documents was professional work. The letter you wrote me was professional work. He paused. James Whitmore was a lucky man. Eleanor met his eyes. We were lucky together, she said. Grant nodded once, put on his hat and left. The week that followed was the hardest week Eleanor had spent at Silver Creek Ranch, and it was hard in the way that waiting is always harder than action, because action gives you something to do with the fear. She cooked. She tended the garden. She organized the kitchen with the methodical attention of a woman who is keeping her hands busy so her mind doesn't eat itself. She watched Nathan manage the same problem from the other direction he rode the fence lines, checked the cattle, did physical labor from before dawn to after dark with the focused, relentless quality of a man who is afraid of what happens if he stops moving. They were careful with each other during this week. There was a new thing between them now, after the night at the kitchen table and the morning with Grant, and neither of them was quite ready to examine it directly. So they moved around it the way you move around something that is still warm, approaching the edges but not the center. The ranch hands felt the change in the air without being told specifics. Vern, who had taken the letter to the post, and who was smart enough to have pieced together most of the situation from available evidence, said nothing specific but took to riding into town in the evenings in the casual, purposeful way of a man who wants to know what he can hear. Curtis began bringing in extra firewood without being asked, which was the way Curtis expressed solidarity. Danny, for his part, had gone quiet in a different way than his usual quiet, less afraid, more resolved, the way a person goes quiet when they've made a decision they've decided to stand behind. On the 5th day, Briggs came back. Eleanor heard the buggy from the garden, and she went still among the bean poles and waited. This time he didn't come with just one man, he came with 3. The extra 2 were not the kind of men who rode beside buggies for company. Nathan came out of the barn. He stood in the yard and he looked at the 3 men and then at Briggs, and Eleanor could see, from where she stood, that Nathan was doing the same calculation she was doing, measuring the distance between where he was and the house where the documents were stacked under the loose floorboard. She'd put them in 3 days ago, against the possibility that Briggs already knew. "Caldwell," Briggs said. Nathan said, "You're making a habit of showing up without invitation." "I heard you had a visitor from Helena," Briggs said. His voice was pleasant. The pleasantness was a warning. "Old Aldous Grant. I didn't know you and Grant were acquainted." "We're not," Nathan said. "He was acquainted with my father." "And what did Grant want?" "Legal advice," Nathan said. "On water rights. I've had questions about the North Creek easement." It was a smooth lie, Eleanor noted. Smooth enough that she revised her understanding of Nathan Caldwell slightly upward, because a man who can lie that cleanly to a man he's afraid of has more iron in him than he lets on. Briggs looked at him. The pleasantness didn't move, which meant it wasn't real pleasantness. It was a mask, and Briggs was good enough at it to keep it in place, even when he didn't believe what he was hearing. "The note's due in 6 weeks, Briggs said. "I'm aware," Nathan said. "Just making sure we're aligned," Briggs said. He let his eyes move from Nathan across the yard, across the hands who had, Eleanor noticed, drifted in from various places on the property and were now standing at various points around the yard in the unhurried, casual way of men who happened to have come in from the same direction. Vern was by the fence. Curtis was at the corner of the barn. 2 other hands were at the water trough. Nobody was standing in a line. Nobody was doing anything that could be called threatening. They were just there. Briggs looked at them. He looked at Nathan. "Nice to see the men are working well," he said. "They're good men," Nathan said. Briggs's eyes moved one more time over the fence line, across the garden, landing on Eleanor standing among the bean poles with her hands at her sides, looking back at him without expression. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face under the pleasant mask, something calculating, something that was reassessing its picture of the situation. He looked away. He picked up the reins. 6 weeks, Caldwell, he said. He drove out. Nathan stood in the yard until the buggy was out of sight, and then he turned and looked at Eleanor, and their eyes met across the yard, and she gave the smallest nod, and he gave it back. The hands dispersed back to their work without anyone saying a word about it. That evening, Hank Delaney knocked on the kitchen door after supper. Eleanor had not had a direct conversation with Hank since the first day, partly because Hank was not a conversational man, and partly because he had maintained, since her arrival, the careful neutral stance of a man who was reserving judgment. He had never been unkind. He had never been warm. He was the foreman, and he did his job, and he watched her do hers, and he kept his conclusions to himself. So when he knocked on her kitchen door and stood in the doorway turning his hat in his hands, which was the same gesture Vern used when he was being formal, Eleanor understood that something had shifted. Hank said, "Mr. Delaney," Eleanor said. "Sit down if you like." Hank sat. He set his hat on the table and looked at it for a moment. "I've been on this ranch 12 years, he said. Worked under Gerald Caldwell for 8 and Nathan for 4. I was here when the money started going wrong, and I was here when Gerald died, and I've been here for the 3 years since, watching this place get held over Nathan's head like a blade." Eleanor waited. "I want you to know," Hank said, "that what you've done here with the lawyer, with the documents, if Nathan doesn't say it to you plain enough, I'm saying it. You've done right by this ranch." He paused. "And I'd like to know what I can do, whatever needs doing, between now and when this gets settled. You tell me." Eleanor looked at the foreman across the table. She had waited 6 weeks for this conversation, not consciously, not demandingly, but she had understood from the first day that Hank Delaney's buy-in was not going to be given easily and was going to be worth having when it arrived. "I need someone to ride to Henderson's old place," she said, "and to find the Rourke brothers wherever they are. I need them to know that a Helena lawyer is asking about their loan records. I need them to know they're not alone in this." She paused. "Can you do that without it getting back to Briggs?" Hank looked at her, something in his face settled. "Yes," he said, "I can do that. Thank you, Mr. Delaney," she said. He picked up his hat and stood. He paused at the door. "The men call me Hank," he said. "You can call me Hank." Eleanor nodded. "Good night, Hank," she said. He went out, and Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table and let herself feel, for a moment, what it felt like to have the last piece of the foundation fall into place. Then she got up and started the bread for tomorrow. Grant's letter came on a Thursday, 7 days after his visit. It was 3 sentences. "Judge Fairfield has signed the order. Briggs will be served tomorrow morning. Come to the county seat Monday with the original documents." Eleanor read it in the kitchen with Thomas standing beside her and Nathan leaning against the counter, having come in for his morning coffee. She read it twice and then she folded it and looked at Nathan. He was already looking at her. He had read it over her shoulder, she realized, which was something a man only does when he's stopped being careful about the distance between himself and another person. "Monday," said. "Monday," she said. Thomas looked between them. "Is it over?" he said. "Not yet," Eleanor said. "But it started." Thomas accepted this with the pragmatic gravity he brought to most things and went back to his breakfast. Eleanor poured Nathan his coffee, and he took it, and their hands didn't touch in the passing, but they were close, and neither of them moved away from close. Which was a thing that had been happening more in the last week, and that both of them had been treating as though it was unremarkable, which meant they were both aware of it. "I'm going with you Monday," Eleanor said, "to the county seat." "I wasn't going to say otherwise," Nathan said. "Good," Eleanor said. "Because I wasn't asking." Nathan looked at her over his coffee cup, and the expression she had spent 6 weeks naming was fully legible now. Clear as print it was, the expression of a man who has been alone for a long time looking at a person who has made the alone feel like a past condition rather than a permanent one. Eleanor held his gaze for one steady moment, and then she turned back to the stove. Saturday morning she was in the garden at 7 o'clock when she heard horses on the road, and the particular speed of them told her, before she saw them, that this was not ordinary traffic. 4 riders, coming fast, coming from the direction of town. She stood up straight among the bean poles and looked toward the gate and felt something cold move through her. That was not surprise exactly, but was the recognition of a thing she'd been expecting and had hoped would come later. She walked to the gate, not ran, because running was the wrong signal. She unlatched it and stood in the opening. The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. 3 of them she didn't know. The 4th was Roy Hennessy, the county sheriff, who she'd seen twice in town, and who she'd heard Vern describe as a man who tried to do right but had Briggs's money in his ears so often it had affected his hearing. Hennessy looked at Eleanor in the gate with the discomfort of a man who was doing something he didn't entirely believe in. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Sheriff," she said. "I need to speak with Nathan Caldwell," he said. "He's in the barn," she said. She didn't move from the gate. "What's the matter?" Hennessy shifted in his saddle. "Walter Briggs has filed a complaint with the county," he said, claiming theft of proprietary bank documents. The cold thing in Eleanor's chest moved and settled and turned into something harder. "What documents?" she said. "Records pertaining to the Silver Creek account," Hennessy said. "He says they were removed from his bank without authorization." "Those documents," Eleanor said steadily, "are original copies of loan agreements belonging to Nathan Caldwell. They were found in a box of Gerald Caldwell's personal effects in the storeroom of this property. They were never in Briggs's possession." She paused. If Briggs is claiming they were stolen from his bank, he's either confused about which documents he means, or he's lying about which documents he means. Hennessy looked at her. He looked at the riders behind him. "Be that as it may," he said, "I need to." "You need to speak with Nathan," Eleanor said. "I understand." "I'll take you to him." She still didn't move from the gate. "Are those men coming in too?" Hennessy glanced back at the 3 riders. They rode out with me. They can wait by the road," Eleanor said. "I'll take you in alone." There was a pause. One of the 3 riders made a move to step his horse forward, and Eleanor looked at him with an expression that stopped him as completely as a hand on the bridle, and he stopped and looked slightly uncertain about why. Hennessy made a small gesture, and the 3 men held position. "All right," he said. He dismounted, and Eleanor let him through the gate and latched it behind them, and she walked him to the barn, and she was aware, as she walked, that every hand on the property had come to places from which they could see the gate and the yard. The same way they'd arranged themselves when Briggs had come, and none of them had been told to. She said nothing about it. She opened the barn door and said, "Nathan." "Sheriff Hennessy is here." Nathan came from the back of the barn. He looked at Hennessy. He looked at Eleanor. She gave him the same small nod she'd given him before, which this time meant, "I know what this is. Stay steady." "Roy," Nathan said. Hennessy said. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which was something. "Briggs has filed a complaint about documents." "What documents?" "Loan records." "The loan records in complaint," Nathan said, "are my father's personal copies of his original loan agreement. They've been on this property since 1879. They were never in Briggs's bank." He said it the same way Eleanor had said it, without anger, without performance, in the flat tone of a man stating a fact that doesn't require decoration. Hennessy was quiet for a moment. He pulled at the brim of his hat. "Nathan," he said lower, "man to man, I need to know what you're doing. Because Briggs is very upset, and when Briggs is very upset, things start happening in this county that I can't always." He stopped. He glanced at Eleanor, whether because he'd forgotten she was there or because he hadn't forgotten, she couldn't be sure. "Roy," Nathan said, "Aldous Grant from Helena is going to be at the county courthouse Monday morning, with a court order requiring Briggs to produce every loan modification record he's issued in the last 5 years. He paused. "You might want to be there." Hennessy went very still. He was looking at Nathan with the expression of a man who has just been told that the ground he's been standing on is not as he thought, and he's calculating where to put his feet. "A court order," he said. "Signed by Judge Fairfield," Nathan said. The name of the judge did something to Hennessy's that was not minor. Fairfield was not a man you argued with. Eleanor understood from the context, and more importantly, Fairfield was not a man who was associated with Briggs. "This is serious," Hennessy said. "It's been serious," Nathan said, "for 3 years. I'm just the first person who got enough together to do something about it." Hennessy stood there for a moment. He looked at Eleanor one more time, at the woman who had walked him through the gate and positioned herself between him and Nathan's space with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. He put his hat back on properly. "I'll be there Monday," he said. He went back to the gate. Eleanor walked him out. The three riders were still waiting on the road. Hennessy mounted. He looked down at Eleanor from the horse, and he said, in a tone that was perhaps the closest he'd come to an apology without using the word, "How long have you been at Silver Creek, Mrs. Whitmore?" "6 weeks, Eleanor said. He looked at her for a moment. "Feels longer," he said. He rode off with his three companions, and Eleanor latched the gate, and behind her she heard the hands dispersing again, back to their work. And she stood at the gate with her hand on the latch and breathed in and out slowly and let the adrenaline settle. 6 weeks. 6 weeks since she'd stood in this same gate with 9 cents and 3 children, and an empty kitchen ahead of her. 6 weeks of biscuits and bean soup and bread and documents and a dead woman's seeds and a boy with a split lip and a foreman who now told her his name and a man in a barn who couldn't quite finish his sentences when she was leaving the room. 6 weeks, and on Monday it would either begin to break apart or it would break wide open. She turned from the gate. Nathan was standing at the barn door, watching her. The hands were gone. The yard was quiet. It was just the two of them in the morning light, and she was aware of the distance between them, the way she'd been aware of it for 2 weeks and had been managing carefully, and she was aware that she was tired of managing it. She walked toward him. She stopped a foot away. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Always," she said. He looked at her. "I'm scared," he said, "not of Monday. Of after Monday. Of what it means, whatever happens," for he stopped. He looked at the barn door frame. He looked back at her. "For you staying," he said. It came out quiet and direct, the way his most honest things came out. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Nathan," she said. "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's not you don't owe me anything, and I'm not." "Nathan," she said again, and he stopped. "Let's get to Monday first," she said. "And then we'll talk about after." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She went to the kitchen. He went back into the barn. The distance between them had not changed by a single measurable inch. It had changed in every other way. Sunday night. Eleanor, sleep. She in the dark and listened to her children, breathe Thomas, and slow and deliberate even in sleep. Grace is lighter. Samuel's with the small irregular size of a child who ran hard and fell completely, and she thought about all the things she'd put in motion and all the things she could not control. She had organized the documents perfectly. She had found the right lawyer. She had a witness and a foreman and a sheriff who, whatever his failings, would be in that courthouse on Monday because he was afraid of the wrong thing landing on him. She had done everything that could be done. What she could not control was what Briggs would do in the window between now and Monday morning. She got up at 2 o'clock and put on her shoes and her heavy shawl, and she went to the kitchen and she built the fire up and she started bread. Not because they needed bread, because her hands needed something and her mind needed the rhythm and the heat. She heard the door at 3:15. Nathan sat down at the table without a word. She set coffee in front of him. She went back to the bread. He sat with both hands around the mug and stared at the table, and she let him. After a while he said, "My father would have liked you." Eleanor kept her hands in the dough. "Tell me about him," she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking, low and steady, the way people talk at 3 in the morning when the guard is down and the night is long, about Gerald Caldwell, who had built this ranch from nothing and who had loved this land with the specific devotion of a man who has made something from dirt and will, and who had seen the loan going wrong and tried to do something about it and run out of time. He talked for a long time. Eleanor listened and worked the dough, and the fire burned, and outside the Montana night was enormous and still. When he stopped, the kitchen was warm, and the bread was formed and set to rise, and the coffee had gone cold. Eleanor sat down across from him. "Your father planted seeds," she said. "He wrote that letter to Grant. He kept those records." He planted things in the ground and ran out of time to see them grow. She looked at Nathan steadily. We're going to go to that courthouse tomorrow, and we're going to see them grow. Nathan looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, his face was tired and open, in the way faces are at 3 in the morning when there is nothing left to perform. What if it's not enough? He said. Then we figure out what comes next, Eleanor said. That's all there is. You figure out what comes next. She paused. I've been figuring out what comes next since James died. I'm good at it. Nathan's hands were still around the cold mug. He looked at them. He looked at her. I know you are, he said. It was a simple thing. It was not a small thing. They sat at the kitchen table in the last hours of the Montana night, and neither of them spoke, and it was the most honest thing that had passed between them, yet not words, but the willingness to sit in the same silence without flinching. Which is what it means to trust someone, which is what it means to begin. They left for the county seat before sunrise. Eleanor had the children up at 4:30, which Thomas accepted without complaint, and Grace accepted with the compressed silence of a girl who understood the day was serious. And Samuel accepted by falling back asleep against Eleanor's shoulder in the wagon before they'd cleared the gate. Nathan drove. Hank rode alongside on his horse. Vern had come too, without being asked, which Eleanor had expected. And Danny sat in the back of the wagon with the rigid stillness of a young man who had made a decision and was committed to it and was not thinking too hard about it in case the thinking changed his mind. The documents were in a satchel on Eleanor's lap. She kept one hand on it the entire ride. Nathan didn't speak for the first hour, which was fine. The road was dark and the horses knew it, and the Montana sky was doing what it did before dawn, which was nothing, and then everything. The dark lifting in degrees that went from black to blue to the particular gray-purple that came just before the sun committed. At some point, without looking at her, Nathan said, "How are you?" "Ask me tonight," Ella nodded. He drove. The county seat was a town called Harlan, which was larger than Billings by enough to have a proper courthouse and smaller than Helena, by enough to still feel like the West. They arrived at 7:30, which was 90 minutes before Grant had said to be there, and Eleanor had intended that because she wanted to see the courthouse before anyone else arrived, and because she wanted to know the room. She always wanted to know the room. Grant was already there when they arrived, which told her he'd ridden through the night, which told her he took this as seriously as his letter had suggested. He was in the small anteroom outside the judge's chambers with his satchel open on the table, and spurs spread in front of him and a cup of coffee that looked like it had been hot 2 hours ago. He looked up when Eleanor came in. He looked at the satchel on her arm. "You have everything," he said. "Everything," she said. She set it on the table beside his papers. "Danny came?" Grant said. "He's outside," Eleanor said. Grant nodded. He looked at Nathan. "Judge Fairfield will see us at 9 o'clock. He's reviewed the order and he's prepared to hear the initial argument." He paused. "Briggs has been notified. He'll be here." Nathan's jaw tightened once. "With his lawyer?" "Almost certainly," Grant said. "A man named Tikanor, from Billings. I know him. He's competent. He's also the kind of lawyer who's very good when his client is innocent and considerably less good when his client is not." Grant looked at Nathan steadily. "This is not a trial. Today is a preliminary hearing. Fairfield is going to look at the evidence and decide whether the order stands and whether a full investigation proceeds. We are not trying to win everything today. We are trying to make it impossible for Briggs to make this go away." "What do you need from me?" "The truth," Grant said. Plainly told, no anger, no performance. Just what happened and when. "Fairfield respects precision." He paused. "And I need you to let me do the talking unless Fairfield addresses you directly." Nathan nodded. Grant looked at Eleanor. "You won't be called in the hearing," he said. "Your role today was in the preparation." "I know," Eleanor said. She said it without disappointment, because she had already understood that. She had understood it from the beginning, actually, that she was the person who found the thing, organized the thing, wrote the letter that started the thing. and that the room where the thing was decided would have Nathan's name on the paperwork, because it was Nathan's ranch and Nathan's father's letter and Nathan's signature that had been forged. That was how the world worked. She didn't have to like it. She had to use it. "I'll be outside with the children," she said. "Danny knows where to find me." At 9:05, Walter Briggs arrived. Eleanor was sitting on the bench in the corridor with Samuel in her lap, and Grace, beside her, and Thomas, standing at the window, the way Thomas stood when he was trying to look like he wasn't paying attention to everything. She heard Briggs before she saw him, his voice in the entrance, talking to his lawyer in a low and controlled way that was designed to project confidence. Then he came around the corner and saw her. He stopped. Just for a second. Just a fraction the pause of a man who had expected her to be at the ranch, miles away, not sitting in the corridor of the Harlan County Courthouse. Then the pleasant mask went back on so fast she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Briggs," she said. His lawyer Tichenor, she assumed. A narrow man in a good coat looked at Eleanor with the calibrating expression of a lawyer assessing a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. "I didn't realize you'd be here," Briggs said. "Nathan Caldwell is my employer," Eleanor said evenly. "I support my employer." Briggs looked at her with the flat, evaluating look that men use when they're trying to determine whether a person is a threat or an inconvenience. And Eleanor looked back at him with the calm of a woman who has been looked at that way many times and has stopped finding it destabilizing. "This matter doesn't concern you," Briggs said. "It concerns the ranch where my children sleep," Eleanor said. "That makes it concern me." Briggs's lawyer touched his arm. Briggs looked at her one more moment and then went through the double doors into the hearing room. Eleanor sat back on the bench and smoothed Samuel's hair with one hand and breathed in and out slowly. Thomas came away from the window and sat beside her. "He doesn't like you," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "Because you're not scared of him," Thomas said. Eleanor looked at her son. "I'm scared of him," she said. "I've been scared of him since the first time I saw him ride up to the ranch." "Fear is useful, Thomas. It keeps you sharp. What matters is what you do while you're scared." Thomas thought about this. "What are you doing?" he said. "Sitting here," Eleanor said, "and waiting, and trusting that the right preparation is better than any amount of wishing." Thomas nodded slowly in the way he nodded when he was filing something away permanently. The hearing took 2 hours and 11 minutes. Eleanor knew this because she counted in the way you count things when you have nothing to do but wait, and the stakes are high enough that your body needs something to hold on to. She sat with her children. She watched Danny go in at the 40-minute mark, called by the bailiff, and she watched his face when he went in tight, resolved, older than 18, and she watched it when he came back out 20 minutes later, and he sat down beside her on the bench and put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stayed that way for a moment. "You all right?" Eleanor said quietly. "Yeah," Danny said. He sat up. His face was pale but steady. "I said it all. Everything I saw." Tichenor tried to say I wait to read the numbers clearly, and Grant he stopped. A small involuntary sound that was almost a laugh. "Grant just handed me the modification agreement and asked me to read the numbers on it out loud and then said, so these are the kind of numbers you can read at that distance," and Tichenor sat down. Eleanor put her hand briefly on Danny's shoulder. He straightened slightly under it in the way of a young man who is not accustomed to being touched kindly and isn't sure what to do with it. "You did good," Eleanor said. "Don't know yet," Danny said. "You did," she said. "Whatever happens." They waited. At the 2-hour mark, Hank came out and looked at Eleanor and said, "Briggs just called 3 character witnesses by affidavit. Men from Billings who say Nathan's been unstable since his father died. That Nathan has a history of misreading financial documents." Eleanor felt something cold and sharp move through her. "Can they do that?" "Grant's objecting," Hank said. "But Fairfield's listening." She looked at the closed double doors. She thought about the character witnesses, 3 men from Billings, men who owed Briggs money. Men who would say what they were told to say, and who would not think of it as lying, because they'd long since learned to align their memory with their debts. She thought about Fairfield listening. She stood up. "Who's in there right now?" she said. "Fairfield, Grant. Tichenor, Briggs, Nathan," Hank said. "Is Grant done presenting the documents?" "He finished the document argument 20 minutes ago," Hank said. That's when Briggs's side started with the witnesses. Eleanor thought for 3 seconds. "I need paper," she said. Hank stared at her. "Eleanor." "Paper and a pen, Hank," she said. "There's a clerk's office at the end of this corridor." Hank went. He came back in 45 seconds with 2 sheets of paper and a pen, and Eleanor sat down at the bench and wrote, quickly and without pause, because she'd been composing it in her head since the moment she understood what Briggs's lawyer was doing. She wrote an affidavit, her own, attesting to her 6 weeks at Silver Creek Ranch, to the state of the financial records as she had found them in the box from the storeroom, to the specific documents she had organized and the specific discrepancies she had identified, and to her professional experience. She wrote, without embellishment, that she had managed the bookkeeping for Whitmore Farm in Jefferson County for 11 years and had consulted on the Jefferson County land dispute case of 1,879, which Aldous Grant of Helena could confirm. She signed it. She dated it. She folded it. "Give this to Grant," she said to Hank. "Tell him it's an affidavit of professional witness on the document analysis. Tell him it establishes that the person who identified the signature discrepancy had a professional basis for that identification." Hank looked at the folded paper. He looked at her. Can he use this mid-hearing?" "He can ask Fairfield to admit it as supplemental evidence," Eleanor said. "Whether Fairfield admits it is Fairfield's decision. But Grant should have the option." Hank looked at her for 1 more second. Then he went to the double doors and spoke to the bailiff, and the bailiff went inside, and Eleanor sat down and picked up Samuel, who had begun to fuss, and held him against her and breathed. The doors opened at the 2-hour 11-minute mark. Nathan came out first, and she read his face before he reached her, and what she read was not defeat and was not victory, but was something in between that was still moving. Grant came out behind him. He caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a nod that was precise and small and told her more than words would have. Briggs came out last. His lawyer was speaking low and fast in his ear, and Briggs was listening with the controlled expression of a man receiving news he doesn't like and deciding how to absorb it. Nathan crossed the corridor and sat down beside Eleanor. He was quiet for a moment. Samuel reached up and grabbed his coat lapel with one chubby hand, which Samuel did to people he decided were safe, and Nathan looked down at Samuel's hand on his coat with an expression that was very close to undone. "The order stands," Nathan said. "Briggs has to produce every loan modification record from the past 5 years. Grant has 60 days to review them with a court-appointed examiner." He paused. "Fairfield didn't rule on the forgery today. He said that requires the handwriting expert. But he admitted your affidavit." He looked at her. He read it out loud. "In the hearing, he said it established a credible professional basis for the document analysis, and that the character witness affidavits submitted by Briggs's side were insufficient to outweigh it." Eleanor sat very still. "He read it out loud," she said. "Word for word," Nathan said. She looked down at Samuel, who had fallen back asleep with Nathan's lapel still in his fist. She thought about James, who had taught her that precision in writing was a form of respect. She thought about a Jefferson County land dispute in 1879 and a lawyer named Aldous Grant, who had said James was a good witness, clear head. She thought about what it meant that James's care, his teaching, his careful habits, all of it had traveled forward through time and arrived in this courthouse on this morning through her hands and her memory of him. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. "Well," she said after a moment. Nathan was looking at her. He said, "Don't," she said quietly. "Not unkindly. Not here." He nodded. He understood, which was one of the things that was true about him that she had noticed over 6 weeks of working beside him. Grant came and sat with them and laid out what came next in the plain, organized way that she had come to understand was simply how he thought. 60 days for document review. A handwriting expert from Helena who Grant already had in mind. The Rourke brothers had been contacted by Hank's writer and were willing to provide their own records. Henderson's widow was still in the county and had kept her husband's original paperwork in a trunk under her bed for 3 years waiting. They had not been the only ones waiting. Briggs caught up with them in the corridor on the way out. He did not come with his lawyer. He came alone, which told Eleanor something, and he came quickly enough that she suspected he'd been calculating the moment since the doors opened. "Caldwell," he said. Nathan stopped. He turned. Briggs looked between Nathan and Eleanor. He looked at Eleanor the way he'd been looking at her since the first day in the garden. But something in the look had changed. The contempt was still there. But under it now was something else. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like recalculation. "I'd like to discuss a settlement," Briggs said. The corridor went very quiet. Nathan looked at him. "A settle note," Briggs said. "I'm prepared to there may have been administrative errors in the modification agreements. I'm willing to review the account and adjust the outstanding balance." Administrative errors. Eleanor looked at this man who had forged Nathan's signature 3 times and taken $5,000 that didn't belong to him and put his hands on an 18-year-old boy's face for witnessing it. And she looked at his pleasant mask and the word administrative underneath it. And she felt something move through her that was not anger, exactly, but was all the things that exist below anger. "Nathan," she said. Nathan looked at her. She did not say anything more. She didn't have to. They had sat at the same table at 3 in the morning and talked about what came next, and she had learned his face across 6 weeks of honest living, and he had learned hers, and what passed between them in that look was complete without words. Nathan turned back to Briggs. "Any offer you have," he said, "goes through Aldous Grant. You talk to me through my lawyer from here on." He paused. "And Mr. Briggs' administrative errors are the kindest way to describe what we found. I suggest you spend the next 60 days finding a considerably kinder description, because the court examiner is going to find everything that we found, and a great deal more. And what you call it then will matter considerably more than what you call it now." Briggs's pleasant mask held. "Barely. You're making an enemy," he said quietly. "I think," Nathan said, with the calm of a man who has worked something through and arrived on the other side of it, "that you made that decision for both of us about 3 years ago." He walked past Briggs. Beside him, Hank fell in behind. Danny walked with his chin up and his jaw set and did not look at Briggs at all, which was its own kind of statement. They walked out into the Montana morning, and the air was cooler than it had been in weeks, and the sky was the particular blue of September coming in at the edges of August. On the ride home, Samuel slept, and Grace leaned against Eleanor's arm, and Thomas sat in the back with Danny, and they talked in the low, intermittent way of 2 young people who have been through something and are still processing the shape of it. Nathan drove. After about an hour, without looking at her, he said, "The affidavit." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You wrote it in 45 seconds. "I wrote it in my head for 2 hours before that," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then Jefferson County land dispute, 1,879. "James was a witness," she said. "I sat in the back of that courtroom for 2 days and I paid attention." She paused. "I pay attention to most things, I've noticed," Nathan said. Silence. "The road, the horses, the sky," Nathan said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him, and she saw that he was working something out, turning it over with the careful deliberateness that characterized him when he was approaching something that mattered. "After," he said. "You said we'd talk about after Monday." "I did," she said. "It's after Monday," he said. The road was long and quiet, and the children were present, and the words were going to have to wait for their proper place, which was not a wagon on a public road, and she thought he knew that as well as she did. "Tonight." He nodded. He drove. They got back to Silver Creek Ranch at 3 in the afternoon, and the men were there, all of them, more or less, in the yard or near it, and when the wagon came through the gate, Vern, who had stayed back to hold things down, looked at Nathan's face and then at Eleanor's face and read them both with the accuracy of a man who has been reading people for 50 years. "Order stands," Vern said. "Order stands," Nathan said. What happened then was not dramatic. It was not a cheer or a celebration. These were ranch hands, not theater people. What happened was that Curtis said good in his flat way and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and the young hand whose name Eleanor had finally learned was Pete said about time under his breath. And Vern put his hand briefly on Nathan's shoulder and then dropped it, and Danny went and sat on the fence rail with his face in the afternoon light and just sat there for a few minutes, which was the most honest celebration she'd ever seen. Grace went immediately to the garden. Thomas went to the woodpile. Samuel, now fully awake, trotted after Vern because he had decided in the past 2 weeks that Vern was the most interesting person on the property. Eleanor went to the kitchen. She built the fire. She put on the coffee. She started supper, because the world had shifted today in ways that would take time to fully understand, and meals still needed making, and in Eleanor's experience, a good meal at the end of a hard day was not a small thing and had never been. Nathan came to the kitchen doorway at 4 o'clock. "Can I come in?" "Your kitchen," she said. "It's your kitchen," he said. "Has been since the first week." She didn't argue with that, because he wasn't wrong. He came in and sat at the table, and she poured coffee and sat across from him, and they were alone for the first time since the corridor of the courthouse that morning. And the particular quality of being alone with Nathan Caldwell after 6 weeks of building something together had its own weight that she felt in her sternum. "After," she said. "After," he said. He looked at his coffee. He looked at her. He had never been a man who said things easily. She'd understood that from the first week, the way his truest things came out sideways, at unexpected angles, at 3 in the morning when the guard was down. But he was trying to say this one directly, and she could see him working at it. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the ranch needs a cook. Not because your children need a roof and I've got one to spare. Those things are true, but they're not the reason." He paused. "I want you to stay because this place is different with you in it, and I don't mean the kitchen, I mean all of it. The way the men are. The way I am." He stopped. He was looking at the table now. "I've been running this ranch like a man trying to keep something from dying. You came here and started growing things. It's different. The difference matters." Eleanor looked at him across the table. She thought about everything she'd carried into this kitchen on that July morning, the 9 cents, the 3 children, the canvas sack with the Bible pressing through it, the 4 doors that had been shut in her face before this one. She thought about what it had cost her to walk through this gate and say she was there for the cook's job, and she started tonight. She thought about what it had given her. "Nathan," she said. He looked up. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay because my children are different here too. Thomas talks to the men like he belongs to something. Grace has learned the names of every plant in that garden. Samuel asks me every morning if we can stay, and I have been saying not yet for 6 weeks. She paused. "I'd like to stop saying not yet." Nathan's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. The tiredness lifted. Not all the way. Not permanently. But enough. Like a window opened. "There are things to figure out," he said. "Practical things. The ranch isn't settled yet. The investigation's still going. I don't have a lot to offer you, that's certain. I've been living without certain for 8 months," Eleanor said. "I don't need real. This is real," Nathan said. "Whatever else it is, it's real." "Then that's enough to start with," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He reached across the table and set his hand on top of hers, which was the first time he had touched her deliberately and on purpose, and the warmth of it moved through her in the way warmth moves when you haven't realized how cold you've been. "I need to say something else," he said, "and I need to say it plainly." "Go ahead," she said. "What you look like," he said carefully. "Your size. I know the world has treated that as a thing to hold against you. I know it's been used against you, in Billings in town, by Briggs, by women talking to your daughter on the road. He paused. I want you to know that I see you, not around that. Not in spite of that. I see you, the whole of you, and there is nothing in what I see that I want to look away from. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said his most honest things. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about James, who had looked at her the same way, not as a project or an exception or a woman he had generously decided to see past, but simply and completely as her. She had thought, after James, that she would not be seen that way again. She had thought it was a particular grace that didn't come twice. James used to say, she said slowly, that the people who can't see past what they expect to see are people who are going to miss most of the world. She looked at Nathan. He was right about that. He sounds like he was right about a lot of things, Nathan said. He was, Eleanor said. Sometimes the corner of Nathan's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that came before the smile, which she had been cataloging for 6 weeks, without quite admitting she was doing it. She turned her hand over under his and held it. Supper still needs making, she said. I know, he said. Neither of them moved for another moment. That evening, supper was late by 20 minutes, which nobody complained about, and it was the best meal Eleanor had made since she arrived. Venison stew with the garden onions and the last of the late-season tomatoes, cornbread with honey, and the preserved peaches she'd been saving since she found them on the shelf in the first week. Opened at last, sweet and slightly caramelized and exactly right. Vern tasted the peaches and looked at the ceiling and said nothing, which was the highest compliment in his register. Curtis said, "You've been saving these since when?" "Since the first day," Eleanor said. Curtis looked at her. "You knew you were going to be here long enough to need an occasion?" "I decided I was," Eleanor said. Curtis looked at his bowl. He looked at the peaches. "Huh," he said, in the tone of a man who has revised something significant. Danny ate his supper and did not say much, but before he left the table he looked at Eleanor and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, for all of it." He said it quickly, like something rehearsed but meaning every syllable. "Danny," Eleanor said, "thank you. What you did today mattered. Don't forget that you were the one who walked through that door." Danny nodded and went out, and she heard his boots on the porch steps and then quiet, and she thought that 18 was old enough to do brave things and young enough to still be surprised by having done them. Thomas helped clear the table without being asked and then sat down beside Nathan while Nathan was finishing his coffee and said, in the careful, deliberate way he said things that he'd thought about, Mr. Caldwell. Nathan looked at him. "Thomas, is this our home now?" Thomas said. He said it plainly, without the hedging that adults put around big questions. He said it the way an 11-year-old says something, when he's decided the answer matters enough to ask. Nathan looked at Eleanor, who was at the sink with her back to them. She did not turn around. She waited. Nathan looked back at Thomas. "I'd like it to be," he said, "if your mother agrees." She agreed, Thomas said, with the confidence of a boy who knows his mother. Eleanor kept her hands in the wash water and smiled at the bottom of the sink where nobody could see it. "Then yes," Nathan said, "this is your home." Thomas nodded. He got up and went to bed, and Samuel was already asleep, and Grace lingered long enough to say goodnight to Nathan in the new, easy way she'd found with him in the past week, and then she went too. Nathan brought his coffee cup to the sink and stood beside Eleanor. "Thomas thinks I agreed," she said. "Did you?" Nathan said. She handed him the cup to dry. "Wash your own cup," she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, unpracticed, the laugh of a man who hadn't used it in a while and found it still worked. Eleanor listened to it and thought that the sound of it was something she could stand to hear for a long time. She finished the dishes. He dried them and put them away because he'd learned where they went. The kitchen was clean and warm, and the fire was burning low and right. 60 days, Eleanor said, thinking aloud, for the investigation. Grant thinks it'll be enough, Nathan said. And the Rorkas and Henderson's widow, she said. Their records add to ours. Multiple properties, Nathan said. Grant says that changes the scale of the case entirely. It does, Eleanor said. It means Briggs can't argue it was one account mismanaged. It means it was a practice. She dried her hands on the towel by the sink. He's going to try to settle before the examiner finishes. He'll offer something that sounds generous and is designed to make it go away quietly. I know, Nathan, she said. Nathan looked at her. I won't, he said. I've got better counsel now. She looked at him. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her at the table, open and steady and unhurried. And the kitchen was theirs the way it had been theirs, since the first morning when she handed him a coffee and told him to sit down. And outside the Montana night was large and quiet, and September was coming in at the edges of August. Good night, Nathan, Eleanor said. Good night, Eleanor, he said. He went to the door. He paused, which he had a habit of doing, and she waited for whatever came at the pause. The peaches, he said. We've got a tree out past the east fence. Nobody's tended it in 2 years. It'll need work in the spring. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression that was no longer difficult to name. It had never been difficult to name. She'd known it from the 3rd week. She'd just been careful with it. Show me in the spring, she said. He went out. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen and listened to his boots cross the yard, and the night settle back into itself. And she stood with her hands at her sides and let herself feel the full weight of the day, the courthouse, the corridor. The look on Briggs's face when Nathan walked past him, the sound of Nathan's laugh, the way Thomas had said, "This is our home now," with the unassailable certainty of a child who has decided something. She let herself feel it, all of it, and then she built the fire up enough to last through the night, and she went to bed. In the storeroom, the peach tree was already deciding what it would do in the spring. The 60 days did not pass quietly. Eleanor had not expected them to. She had understood. From the morning they walked out of the Harlan courthouse past Walter Briggs. That 60 days was not a rest, it was a different kind of work, slower and less visible than what had come before, but no less demanding. It was the kind of work that happened in lawyers' offices and courthouse file rooms, and at kitchen tables late at night. And it was the kind that required patience, which was a thing she had built in herself over the past 8 months, the way you build muscle, by needing it constantly and having no alternative. Grant wrote twice in the first 2 weeks. The court examiner had begun. Briggs had submitted his records under protest, which Grant had noted with the dry precision of a man who found protests from the guilty instructive rather than surprising. The examiner's name was a woman, Margaret Hollis, appointed by Judge Fairfield, and Grant mentioned this in his letter as though it were simply a fact, which it was. And Eleanor read the name and thought about what it meant that Margaret Hollis existed and was doing this work, and she did not say anything about it to anyone, but she thought about it. The Rourke brothers came to Silver Creek Ranch on a Wednesday in early September. There were 2 of them, Cal, who was 40 and had the compact, weathered quality of a man who had been working land all his life, and his younger brother Eben, who was 34 and had the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had been burned and had rearranged his trust accordingly. They came in a wagon with their own records in a box, which told Eleanor they'd been keeping them the way Gerald Caldwell had kept his, out of instinct, out of something that was almost hope, saving the evidence of a wrong against the possibility that someday the wrong could be addressed. Nathan met them in the yard. Eleanor came out of the kitchen when she heard the wagon, wiping her hands on her apron. And Cal Rourke looked at her, and then at the kitchen, and then at the yard full of working men, and at the garden through the fence with its late-season tomatoes still on the vines, and something moved across his face. "This place looks different than the last time I came through," Cal said to Nathan. "It is different," Nathan said. Cal looked at Eleanor. "You the one who wrote to Grant?" he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Cal looked at her for a moment with the assessing look of a man who is deciding whether someone is real. Then he nodded once, with the weight of a man who has been waiting a long time for something to happen, and is still not sure he believes it's happening. "Our father lost that land," Eben said. He said it looking at the ground, and then he looked up. "He died thinking it was his fault, that he'd been careless, that he'd trusted wrong and it was on him." His voice was flat, but under the flat was something that had been living in him for a long time. If it wasn't his fault, if it was done to him, I need someone to say that out loud. Official, where it can be heard. That's what we're working toward, Eleanor said. Eben looked at her. You believe it'll happen? Eleanor did not say yes to be kind. She looked at him honestly and said, The examiner has Briggs's records now. She's finding what we expected to find. Grant believes the evidence is sufficient for a full fraud case. She paused. I believe it'll happen because the right people are doing the right work. Whether it happens the way we want it to, in the time we want it to, that I can't promise you. Eben held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, Fair enough. And she knew that what she'd just given him was something he could use, which was more valuable than a false promise. They stayed for supper. Eleanor made a full meal more than the ranch hands, the Rourkes, the children, and Nathan warranted by head count, which was intentional, because a table set with abundance says something different than a table set with enough. Cal Rourke ate without speaking for a while, and then looked up and said, Lord, woman, in a tone that was identical to the tone Vern had used on the first night, and Eleanor had to look away to keep from smiling. After supper, Nathan and the Rourke sat at the kitchen table with Grant's last letter in the Rourke records and compared numbers until past 10 o'clock. And Eleanor put the children to bed and came back and made coffee and sat at the end of the table and listened and occasionally said something that redirected the conversation in a useful direction. And nobody at the table remarked on her presence because by this point her presence at difficult conversations was simply understood to be part of how Silver Creek Ranch handled its business. The Rourkes left the next morning with Grant's address in Helena and the knowledge that they were not alone. Eben stopped at the gate on his way out and looked back at Eleanor, who was at the garden fence. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then our father's name was Henry Rourke. He worked that land for 22 years. I know, Eleanor said. I remember it from the documents. Just wanted to say it out loud, Eben said. His name. Here. He looked at the ranch around him. In a place where someone's listening. Eleanor looked at him. Henry Rourke, she said. Eben nodded. He drove out. Eleanor stood at the garden fence and thought about names and what it meant to say them in places where someone was listening, and she thought about James, and she went back to work. The settlement offer came on a Thursday in the 5th week. It came through Tycanor, which meant Briggs had the sense to know that sending it himself would be read as weakness. It was addressed to Aldous Grant and forwarded to Nathan, and it proposed, in the careful language of a legal document trying to sound generous, the forgiveness of the remaining balance on the Silver Creek note, the full amount, including the fraudulent portion in exchange for Nathan Caldwell's withdrawal from the fraud case and a signed agreement not to pursue further legal action. Nathan read it at the kitchen table. Eleanor read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He's scared, Nathan said. He's calculating, Eleanor said. There's a difference. He's not scared enough to stop fighting. He's scared enough to try to buy you out before the examiner finishes. She looked at the letter. If you take this, the investigation continues with the Rourkes and Henderson's widow. Briggs loses you, but he doesn't lose everything. He loses Silver Creek, Nathan said. Yes, Eleanor said, and that's what he's paying for. Removing the case that started it all. She paused. If you don't take it and the examiner finds what Grant thinks she'll find, Briggs faces a fraud case across multiple properties. The forgiven note will be included in restitution anyway. And the Rourkes get their father's name cleared. Nathan was quiet. He looked at the letter. He looked at the table. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that was clear and direct and already decided. Write to Grant, he said. To Eleanor nodded. She got the paper. She wrote the letter while Nathan watched, and it was brief and precise in the way that mattered, and when she signed it on Nathan's behalf as she had done twice before, with his explicit instruction and Grant's awareness, she felt the weight of what it meant to put her hand to paper in someone else's name with their full trust. James had taught her that a signature was a legal instrument. She had never in her life been more careful with one. Margaret Hollis submitted her preliminary findings on a Friday morning in the 7th week. Grant sent a rider with the summary, rather than trusting it to the postal route, which told Eleanor he considered the content significant enough to require speed. The rider arrived at Silver Creek before noon. Eleanor was in the kitchen. Nathan took the papers from the rider and came inside and read them standing at the counter, and she watched his face while he read. She had learned to read him well enough by now to read the news in his expression before he told her. His jaw went tight, then it released. His shoulders dropped not in defeat, in relief, which looked similar from a distance but was entirely different up close. He looked up. 5 properties, he said. She found it on 5 properties. Not just ours. Henderson, both Rourke parcels. A widow in the southern county named Clara Aldrich, who lost her place in 1882, and a cattle operation east of here that's been under Briggs's management for 3 years. He set the papers down. Total fraudulent debt across the 5 properties, Grant's estimate based on Hollis's numbers, somewhere between $18,000 and $22,000. Eleanor was very still. $22,000, she said. Take, Nathan said. From 5 families over 6 years. His voice was controlled, but she could hear under the control the thing that wanted to be anger and was being held carefully. Eben Rourke's father, Eleanor said, included, Nathan said. The numbers on the Rourke parcel alone show $800 in fraudulent debt over 3 years. That's $800 that broke a man who spent 22 years building something. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor thought about Henry Rourke. She thought about Clara Aldrich, whose name she was hearing for the first time, and who had lost her place in 1882 and who would now be finding out that it had not been her failure. She thought about Gerald Caldwell's unsent letter arriving after he was already gone. She thought about all the people who had been sitting alone with the weight of something that had been done to them, believing it was their fault, not knowing that 4 other families were sitting with the same weight, in the same silence. Grant is petitioning for a full criminal fraud case, Nathan said. He says Fairfield is prepared to move quickly. He paused. He also says that in his professional opinion, Briggs will not fight a criminal case. He'll negotiate terms, which means, Eleanor said. Which means it ends, Nathan said. Not in a trial. In Briggs accepting terms that include restitution across all 5 properties. He looked at her. It means the Rourkes get something back. Henderson's widow. Clara Aldrich. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the papers Nathan had set down, and she let herself understand fully what had begun on that first morning in the garden when she watched Briggs's eyes move over the ranch with the look of a man taking inventory of what he expected to own. 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago. The morning she'd walked 9 miles through the dust with 9 cents and 3 children and a canvas sack with the Bible pressing through the bottom. She had not come here to save 5 families from a crooked banker. She had come here to feed 20 men and give her children a room to sleep in. But you could not build a real thing in the middle of a wrong thing and pretend the wrong thing wasn't there, and she had never been able to pretend, which was both her greatest difficulty and, apparently, the most useful thing about her. Tell Grant yes, she said. Tell him yes on the full case. Nathan was looking at her. Eleanor, he said. And there was something in the way he said it, the particular weight of her name in his voice, which she had catalogued the way she'd catalogued everything, the laugh and the lapel and the 3 in the morning honesty. Don't make me emotional in the kitchen, she said. I've got bread rising. He laughed, again that real surprised laugh that she had decided was one of her favorite sounds in the world, and she got up and went to check the bread, and the kitchen was warm, and they were still standing in the same room. The case against Walter Briggs was settled formally on a Tuesday in November. Eleanor was not in the room when it happened, neither was Nathan, because Grant had advised that their presence was unnecessary, and that, frankly, the negotiation would go faster without the people Briggs had most reason to resent sitting across a table from him. They were at Silver Creek Ranch when Grant's rider came. and they were together in the kitchen, which was where they were most mornings now. And the rider came through the gate. Nathan went out to meet him and came back in and set the letter on the table between them. Eleanor read it with her hands flat on either side of it. The settlement required full restitution across all 5 affected properties, totaling $19,400, paid from Briggs's personal holdings into a court-administered account, distributed according to the fraudulent amounts identified by the examiner. It required the surrender of Walter Briggs's banking license in the territory and his agreement to divest from all properties in which he held a financial interest. It required a formal record in the territorial court acknowledging the fraudulent nature of all 5 loan modifications. That last part had been Grant's specific insistence, and Eleanor suspected it had been Grant's insistence on behalf of Eben Roark, who had stood at the gate and said his father's name out loud in a place where someone was listening. Nathan would receive full forgiveness of the original Silver Creek note plus restitution of the fraudulent interest, which amounted to more than $4,000 returned to the ranch. Eleanor read it twice. She looked up. Nathan was watching her. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She looked at the letter one more time. She thought about 7 weeks of this, the courthouse, and the documents, and the 3 in the morning conversations, and the settlement offer. She'd watched Nathan refuse without hesitating, and the bread that had needed making through all of it. Every morning, because the world continued to require feeding regardless of what else was happening in it. She thought about Henry Roark and Clara Aldrich, and all the people who had been sitting alone with their weights. "We should write to the Roark," she said. "Today. Before they hear it from someone else." "Already thought of it," Nathan said. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was already written. His handwriting, plain and careful, telling the Roarkies what the settlement contained and what it meant for them. Eleanor read it. At the end he had written, "Henry Roark's name has been entered into the court record as a defrauded party. The record will stand." She set the letter down. She pressed her hand flat on top of it for a moment. "Send it today." "I will," he said. She stood up and went to check the bread, and Nathan followed her to the kitchen and leaned against the counter behind her, the way he had been leaning against counters in her kitchen for 2 months, close enough to talk. Careful about the space between them, which had been getting smaller in degrees that were measurable if you were paying attention. And she had always been paying attention. "Eleanor," he said. She did not say don't this time. She turned around. He was closer than she'd realized, or she'd realized exactly, and was being honest about it, which amounted to the same thing. He looked at her with the expression that had been legible for weeks, clear and steady and decided, the look of a man who has worked something through to the end and arrived at a place he intends to stay. "I have something I need to ask you," he said. "Go ahead," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who spoke lightly, and he was not going to speak lightly about this. She waited and let him find the words in the right order. "I know this ranch isn't settled yet," he said. "I know the money's coming back, but the herd still needs work, and the south fence is down, and there's nothing about the next year that I can promise is going to be easy." He paused. "I know you've had easy taken from you before, and you found a way through it, and I know you don't need me to take care of you, because you've been doing that better than anyone for longer than you should have had to." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking to take care of you. I'm asking to stand beside you. Whatever comes, the work, the hard years, the seasons that go wrong. Beside you, not in front of you. You and your children." He paused one more time. "Marry me, Eleanor. Not because you need this ranch. Because I want to build something real with the person who already knows what real costs." Eleanor looked at Nathan Caldwell in her kitchen, his kitchen, their kitchen, the kitchen she had walked into with nothing and built into the heart of a place, and she thought about James, who had made her feel seen and had taught her what real looked like, and she thought that what she owed James was not the refusal of this but the honoring of what he'd taught her. Because what he'd taught her was that real was worth building and worth protecting and worth beginning again, if it was truly real. She thought about 9 cents and 3 children and 9 miles through the dust. She thought about seeds in a dead woman's pocket. She thought about bread that needed making every single morning, regardless of everything else. Yes, she said. Nathan's face did something she'd been cataloging for 2 months. And the something was the full version of the thing she'd been cataloging, the tiredness gone, the guard gone. The careful, controlled distance of a man who has been running a ranch alone for 4 years and has finally let himself stop running it alone. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and the kitchen was warm and the bread was rising, and outside the Montana November was coming in hard and cold against the windows. Thomas is going to say he knew, Eleanor said. Nathan laughed. He did know. He was insufferable about it, Eleanor said. He's 11, Nathan said. He's earned insufferable. She squeezed his hand once and then let go, because the bread genuinely needed attending to. And Nathan let her go because he had learned, over 2 months, which battles were worth the attempt. And bread was never one of them. She told the children that evening, after supper when the hands had gone and the kitchen was theirs. Thomas said, I know, without looking up from the book he was pretending to read, with the magnificent serenity of a boy who has been waiting for the adults to catch up. Grace made a sound that was partly surprise and partly relief and completely joy, and then she got up and put her arms around Eleanor's middle without saying a word, which was Grace's way of saying everything she had. Samuel looked between them and said, Does that mean we're really staying? And when Eleanor said yes, Samuel said good with enormous finality and went back to the toy horse Vern had carved him out of a piece of fence post 2 weeks ago. Later, after the children were in bed, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes in the quiet. The lamp was low. The fire was banked. The house was settled around her, the small sounds of it, the particular language a building speaks when it has people in it who belong there. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, the way the kitchen had smelled, the abandoned smell of it, the grease and ash and the small creature in the corner. The way Hank had stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his skepticism like a second layer of clothing. The way she'd stood in the center of that ruined room and asked where the stove was. She had walked in with nothing, and she'd started that night because there was no alternative to starting, and she had stopped waiting for conditions to be right before she did what needed to be done. Nathan knocked on the kitchen door at 9 o'clock. She said, Come in. He came in and sat across from her, and they sat in the quiet together the way they had learned to sit in quiet together, which was one of the most real things she knew about him, that he could be still with her. That he didn't fill silence with noise, that he understood that some of the most important things happen in the space between words. Hank wants to know if we're doing a proper celebration, Nathan said. His word, proper, which from Hank means he wants to know if there will be pie. There will be pie, Eleanor said. What kind? What kind does Hank want? I didn't ask. Tomorrow? Tonight, she said. He's still awake. He doesn't sleep before 10. Go ask him what kind of pie he wants, Nathan, and let him feel like he's part of this. Because he has been part of this since the moment he walked to that courthouse to stand beside you. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, put his hat on, and went out to find Hank. Because this was what she had always done, not asked people to care, but given them specific, real ways to belong to something. And Nathan had understood this about her a long time ago and was learning to do it himself. He came back 8 minutes later and said, Apple. I'll need to get apples, Eleanor said. Vern has a deal with the orchard in town, Nathan said. I'll send him in the morning. Good, he sat back down. They spring, Nathan said. What about spring, she said. The peach tree, he said. Past the east fence. I said I'd show you. You did, she said. We'll go out in March, he said. When the ground starts to soften, start cutting the dead wood back. He paused. It'll take 2 seasons to really come back, maybe 3. But it'll come back. Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen table and thought about 2 seasons and 3 seasons and what it meant to plan in those increments, not just to survive until spring, not just to get to the end of winter, but to look at a damaged thing and say it will take time, and I will be here for the time it takes. March, she said. He said. The apple pie happened on a Saturday, and it was the kind of afternoon that Silver Creek Ranch would talk about for a long time. Not because anything dramatic occurred, but because of the specific quality of the ordinary, which is harder to achieve than drama and worth considerably more. Eleanor made 3 pies. Vern had brought back apples enough for 6, which was classic Vern, and Eleanor had sent the extra 4 to Clara Aldrich, the widow in the southern county, with a note that said, "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was glad to help. I hope next spring is easier than this one." She had hesitated over the name and then written it plainly, because she was done with small versions of herself. Hank tasted the first piece of pie and sat back in his chair with his arms crossed and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who has been converted to something he'd resisted and is still figuring out how to carry the new belief. "I should have not been a fool about you," he said in the beginning. "You were appropriately cautious," Eleanor said. "I was a fool," Hank said. "You can say it. You were cautious," Eleanor said. And then you weren't, and that's the part that mattered." Hank looked at her. He nodded once with the weight of a man accepting something he'd been offered that he genuinely needed. He ate his pie. Danny had a second piece and then a third and apologized for the third, and Eleanor told him not to apologize for appetite, and the men laughed. And Danny sat back in his chair with the posture of a young man who has done something frightening and survived it and is beginning to understand what that means about the kind of person he is. Thomas sat between Vern and Curtis at the table, and they talked to him the way the men had started talking to him weeks ago, like someone who belonged to the conversation, not someone being indulged in it. Grace sat beside Nathan, and at some point in the afternoon, he asked her something about the garden, and she answered in the specific, informed way she'd developed over 3 months of tending it. And Nathan listened with the full attention he gave to things that interested him, and Grace noticed him listening and sat up slightly straighter with the quiet pleasure of a child being genuinely heard. Samuel fell asleep under the table with his head on Vern's boot, and Vern did not move his boot for the entire duration of Samuel's nap, and if anyone noticed, no one said a word about it. Eleanor stood at the edge of all of it and let herself see it whole. This was what she had walked 9 miles in July heat to find, though she hadn't known how to say that then. She'd said she was there for the cook's job, and she'd meant it. But underneath the cook's job and the room for her children and the 9 cents and the canvas sack underneath all of it, this was what she'd been looking for. Not rescue, not charity, not someone to decide she was worth something. A place to build, people to build with, the right to stand in the middle of a real life and belong to it on her own terms. She had been told in 4 doorways and 100 sideways looks and a banker's contemptuous gaze and a woman's loud voice on a public street that she was not the kind of person who got to have this. Too large, too poor, too broken, too much and not enough at the same time in all the ways the world decides these things without asking. The world had been wrong. She had known it was wrong. She had known it the way you know something you can't yet prove, with the particular stubbornness a person has decided that the evidence of their own life is more reliable than other people's conclusions about it. She had walked into a ruined kitchen and said, "Tell me where the stove is." And she had started that night. And she had kept starting, every morning, which was all that starting ever was, the decision, made again and again, to do the next thing. The garden was going to need covering for winter. The south fence needed mending before the first snow. There were 20 mouths to feed tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. And the bread would need making, and the fire would need tending, and the work would continue the way work continued, constant and real and worthy of being done well. She was not too large for any of it. She had never been. Nathan found her at the edge of the room. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the table, the men, the children, the 3 pie tins scraped to the crust. The afternoon light coming through the windows and settling on all of it, the way light settles on things when you've stopped being in a hurry and let yourself see them. "Well," he said quietly. "Well," she said. His hand found hers at their sides, and she let it, and they stood together in the kitchen of Silver Creek Ranch on a Saturday afternoon in November, with the Montana winter coming in hard at the edges of the world, And she thought of seeds, the ones in the paper packets with the dead woman's handwriting, the ones she'd pressed into the dark ground in August, the ones that were going to come back in spring, whether the winter was hard or easy, because that was what seeds did. That was the whole truth of them, the thing that made them worth planting. You put them in the ground, you did the work, and they came back. Eleanor Whitmore had walked into a forgotten ranch with nothing, and she had brought it back to life, not because she was exceptional or extraordinary or any of the things that stories sometimes want their women to be, but because she had refused, with every quiet and stubborn bone in her considerable body, to believe that what the world saw when it looked at her was the whole of what she was. She had been right. And Silver Creek Ranch, with its warm kitchen and its growing garden and its table, full of people who had learned to take care of each other, was the proof, permanent, undeniable, and real as the bread she would make in the morning. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the world to see them clearly. Eleanor Whitmore had stopped waiting. She had picked up the stove and started the fire and fed whoever was hungry, and the world, in the end, had no choice but to see her exactly as she was. A woman who showed up, a woman who stayed, a woman who brought everyone home.